With just about 20 years of patches, updates and changes, every single class, new or old in World of Warcraft, has undergone so many changes that they are unrecognizable from how they were day one. Whether it's due to new abilities, talent reworks, balancing updates, PvP changes or anything in between. Whatever your main is, it's had one massive journey over the years to reach where it is today. But when was your class at their best? When were they the most broken, the most overpowered? If you could pick one patch or update that Blizzard did that truly made your class into an unstoppable machine, when would that be? Well, that's what I'm going to be trying to answer today. One state of every class when they were arguably at their most powerful ever. I do have some rules here as well. I'm not going to be covering exploits as they can often be non-class specific. I'm also not going to be covering bugs as they were never intended ways to play the game. I'm looking for updates that Blizzard implemented. They checked them out on the PTR, they put them in the game, they said, yep, this looks fine, and then they either had to nerf them fast, or in some cases, they just stayed overpowered for a very long time. And these can also be PvP or PvE related. And I wanted to do honorable mentions for pretty much every class here, but as you can tell from the length of the video, there was already enough to say, and I'm just going to do my best to cover one thing per class. If anything, there'll be a lot of comments with people remembering different states of their class and the moment in time that they would have picked for when they were the best. So definitely let me know what you think, and I'm always up for doing a part 2. With all that said, this for me is the most broken and overpowered state of every class in World of Warcraft over its 20-year history. We're gonna make a start with the plate wearers today and descend down the order of armor types. And we'll begin with warrior. When I think of warrior's most overpowered state, it wasn't a patch or an update where they were changed, it was an expansion. For me to choose warrior's most overpowered state ever, I have to go for Fury Warrior throughout literally the whole of vanilla. If you played much vanilla during classic, era and so on, I'm sure more often than not you've seen a whole lot of warrior on your DPS meters. And one of the key reasons why is how their resource, rage, scaled as they got better gear. Infamously, warriors used to start expansions incredibly weak and then by the end of them be complete beasts, and it was really all down to rage. The reason why is warrior's rage before Cataclysm was not normalized, meaning the more damage you deal with your auto attacks, the more rage you can generate. And when you get more rage, you can spend more rage, and then you upgrade your gear and you can get more rage and you have more rage to spend, and you can kind of see the loop that happens here where the better your gear gets, the more damage you get, but just on a much more exponential level than any other class. This made warrior scale better with gear than any other class by an absolute mile. Also, there were some extra tricks here. For example, human and orc racials for weapon skills in vanilla actually ended up giving extra hit chance. I imagine when they put these flavoursome things in the game when it was first releasing, they didn't think too much of it. They just thought, orcs, they use axes, humans use swords and maces, let's put that in the game, it sounds fun. But it ended up being extremely impactful. This bonus to 5 weapon skill also affected glancing blows. So against a boss level enemy, each auto attack has a 40% chance to be a glancing blow, which deal 65% of regular damage. But if you were using a +5 skill ratio and used an appropriate weapon, of course, this penalty will be reduced to 85% regular damage. And auto attacks made up a significant portion of your damage, so this was kind of a very big deal. Other melee could benefit from this too as well, but other melee didn't get more resources from having their auto attacks hitting harder, so this was a bigger win for the warriors. But wait, there is more. In classic, of course, heroic strike was a rage spender, not an instant attack as it was in Cataclysm. So if you were spamming heroic strike, you couldn't generate rage from your main hand attack because it wasn't going to be an auto attack. However, if you had heroic strike queued to be your next main hand attack, your offhand's hit chance would be modified as if it were also a special attack, effectively lowering its hit chance penalty from 27%, which is pretty bad, down to 6%. So if you were hit capped, it was going to hit, and you were going to keep that rage bar full and be able to spam abilities. You add on top of this world buffs and a shopping list of consumables giving you tons of bonus stats, and of course loads more crits for even more rage. and you end up with a class which even in pre-raid BIS could absolutely dominate others in full Naxxramas gear. And if we take a look at the top 1% of passes logged here, you can really see the end result. This first one shows the last 2 weeks of Naxxramas during Vanilla Classic, where warriors were easily doing 2 times the damage of most other classes, and here's the top 1% of performers on Classic era at the moment. Again, you can see that warriors are just absolutely crushing everyone. If you're playing Vanilla and you want to do damage, you have to pick warrior. It's not a debate. And that's why for me, warrior's most overpowered state ever was in Vanilla. Next up is Paladin. Out of every patch this class has had, the one where I think they were at their strongest has to be right at the start of Wrath of the Lich King. In expansions before that, for the longest time, Ret had either been kind of average as a DPS or a bit of a utility pick, but this was going to change in Wrath of the Lich King. After all, this was an expansion about fighting the endless armies of the Scourge. How could the righteous Vindicator, the Retribution Paladin, not end up being great at demolishing armies of undead? In fact, Wrath of the Lich King launch Retribution was only overshadowed by one other class, which you can probably guess what that's gonna be, more on that in a moment. But Ret in Wrath Classic, when we replayed it, was very different to what we got in 2010 originally, and it was in, to be honest, a very nerfed state. In fact, throughout Wrath Classic, Blizzard even buffed Ret a few times because it was just falling so far behind what people remembered it being. What made them good early on though was pretty simple. They were extremely easy to play, and they did a lot of damage. You walked up to an enemy and you applied Crusader Strike, Judgment and Divine Storm to their face, and it would kind of just delete their health bar. And Paladins back then of course had their great toolkit of utility through blessings and various hands as well, even though your average human male Ret Pala had somewhere between a 5 to 10% chance to have actually keybound anything other than their damage abilities. And Ret did very well in PvE and PvP as well. Launch Wrath of the Lich King Ret Pallies were just in a fantastic state, and for me it has to be one of the most powerful states they've ever been in. Of course, in major patches in Wrath of the Lich King, Ret was toned down again and again till they became a bit more tame, but then they became a bit more powerful at the end of the expansion with their 2-piece tier 10, which gave Divine Storm a chance to reset off auto attacks, as well as of course getting their hands on a Shadowmourne. All in all though, for Paladin, launch Wrath of the Lich King Retribution has to be my choice. Which means next we have the Death Knight, and this is the easiest one on the list by far. I don't even think it's up for debate which the most powerful version of DK ever was, because again, much like Paladin, it was their state they were at when Wrath of the Lich King first launched, and it's just not even close. In fact, Death Knights on Wrath's launch were the most overpowered a class will ever be in this game's history. I don't think anything will top this. When Blizzard said back then they were putting a hero class in the game, oh boy, they meant it. So let me try and break down for you what made them so overpowered. Initially, Death Knights weren't designed with any spec being made for a specific role. If you wanted to DPS as Blood, yeah, you could do that. You want to tank as Unholy, no problem. Do you want to be a hybrid Frost Unholy Blood DPS tank? I mean, yeah, sure, go for it, why not? The whole toolkit was so ludicrously overtuned, you could do anything you wanted to, and it would work, and this went for both PvE and PvP as well. In Season 1 of Wrath's PvP, DKs in barely any gear could absolutely smash their way to high ratings, and in PvE, any spec combo worked for doing anything. I'll tell you a few more things about DK. On launch, Chains of Ice was initially a root before being a decaying slow afterwards. Icebound Fortitude was a 50% damage reduction, which of course made you immune to stuns with a 2-minute cooldown, and you're a DK so you can become immune to magic through Anti-Magic Shell, which was more powerful back then, and you could immune fears too through the talent Lichborn. DK's class design when it came to their self-healing was just a few expansions ahead of every other class, and a blood spec DK could just live endlessly whilst doing great damage. The first version of Plague Strike used to remove heal over time effects. There was a glyph of Death and Decay that gave it a 20% chance to fear you in place for 2 seconds, and it could chain proc off of itself. And when finally you got enough people together to kill a DK, they could resurrect themselves with the Shadow of Death talent and keep on fighting as a ghoul for 45 seconds. And this worked in Arena too, by the way. The entire class class was just the best at everything they could do, and the legacy of Wrath of the Lich King's launch Death Knights and how powerful they were was not an exaggeration. Over time throughout Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard would have to nerf this class again and again and again, and during that process, certain specs rose to prominence for different roles. Blood became the tank, Frost was a dual-wielder DPS, and Unholy was a two-handed DPS. Death Knight still had some of that flexibility they had from launch. For example, in Wrath Classic, it turned out that Unholy actually dual-wielded the whole way through the expansion till they got Shadowmourne, I believe. But at the end of the day, they were a shadow compared to how they were when Wrath first dropped. And by Cataclysm, Blizzard ended up cementing these roles in place for the Death Knight for the future. Either way, those first few weeks of Wrath of the Lich King on the DK were completely out of hand in the most brilliant way possible, and for me the Death Knight's best state ever is easily the launch of Wrath of the Lich King. On to the mail wearers, so let's start with Hunter. For Hunter, I'm going to pick something which is probably a little bit unexpected. In fact, it's from a very recent version of World of Warcraft in the grand scheme of things, but it's one where Hunters have consistently been broken for about as long as this seasonal server has existed. For Hunters, I'm picking the state they were in during early phase 1 of Season of Discovery. So as we all know, Season of Discovery, it's classic WoW's second seasonal server where Blizzard have added a bunch of rune engravings onto gear which allow players to equip new abilities. Kind of like how enchants work, but you can swap them out whenever. Now the thing that was completely broken for Hunters wasn't actually the Hunter themselves, it was their pet. So typically pets in vanilla are, well, they're good until they're not. When you're leveling, they do tons of damage, they generate loads of threat, and they're a huge asset for the Hunter. But then you get to endgame, and Hunter pets don't scale with the Hunter's own stats, meaning they fall off a cliff damage-wise and survivability-wise. On top of that, they have no reduced damage from AoE effects, so when you're on a boss that does AoE stuff, they just die to absolutely anything. And it's just kind of frustrating because, to be honest, you're lucky if your healers even have their pet frames on their bars, and you have to worry about stuff like pet food, training, happiness, you know, all of that good stuff. So along comes Season of Discovery to make changes to the original vanilla format. First up, Hunter pets would now scale with improvements to the Hunter's own gear. Also, there were two new runes to keep in mind. The first one was called Kill Command. This gave Hunter's pets a 60% bonus damage to their next special attack, which was reduced by 20% with each special attack. Now, this gave Hunter's pets 30% more damage and health and 80% more focus regeneration. So with all these tools in hand, Hunters set out into the world once again to find out whether any Hunter pets were overpowered with these changes. As it turns out, they were. Now the first broken one was the Scorpid pet. Now this was technically a bug which I said I wasn't going to include, but it's kind of funny so I'm just going to mention it. But Scorpid's poison wasn't consuming Kill Command, so you had the bonuses from pet scaling on top of straight up a 60% damage non-stop buff whilst Kill Command was active, which made Scorpid do absolutely outrageous amounts of damage. Blizzard did pick up on this one pretty quick though and nerfed the interaction, but Hunters weren't quite done yet. They swapped over to using a Wind Serpent. This is back when the level cap was 25 and there were only a few Wind Serpents in the world which were low enough level to be tamed over in the Southern Barrens. With the extra focus regeneration from the Beast Mastery rune, the new scaling, and Kill Command, Wind Serpent's Lightning Breath ability was doing absolutely outrageous amounts of damage. In PvP, Hunters could hide somewhere, use Eyes of the Beast, and run around people with their pets spamming Lightning Breath, and it could solo any other class in the game. In fact, Hunters could AFK, have their pet on defensive, and there's a pretty good chance they would win a 1v1 because their pets were just so powerful. Also in BFD for a time, Hunter pets were so good, they were better tanks than any actual tank because they could generate tons of threat with Growl, and they were just doing more damage than everyone else was as well. Blizzard would end up nerfing Wind Serpents by just straight up not letting Lightning Breath work with Kill Command, and Season of Discovery is an experimental server and Hunters must have been nerfed over 20 times easily by now. They're still one of the best classes in the game by the way, but for me the start of Season of Discovery has to have been the most powerful state that Hunters have ever been in. On to Shaman, and the moment in time I pick for the Shaman is the state of enhancement during Throne of Thunder and beyond in Mr. Pandaria. Despite Mr. Pandaria changing talent trees so much, they put a lot of things you'd have otherwise found on those trees straight into your spellbook when you picked a spec, and more often than not, it worked out really well. Elemental was definitely in a strong spot during the same time period too, but I'm really just trying to stick to one thing here where possible. During Mr. Pandaria, Enhancement had a number of great things going for them. Elemental Blast was a new talent that could be made instant via Maelstrom stacks. This would hit really hard, as well as increasing the Shaman's own secondary stats. You had Stormlash Totem that was a thing, which is a minor DPS cooldown for the Shaman. Storm Strike, Lava Lash, and even Feral Spirit just did a good amount of damage in their own right compared to other versions of WoW. And of course, Shaman gained a brand new cooldown in Mr. Pandaria, Ascendance. Immorp Ascendance would transform your character's model and would also grant auto attacks and Storm Strike a 30-yard range. And there was just something about being able to hit stuff with blasts of wind from miles away that was really satisfying and fun to use. During this time, Enhancement was able to put out some serious burst and respectable overall damage in PvE and PvP as well. A lot of these features introduced in Mr. Pandaria have carried forwards into future expansions too, as they just fit the class archetype so well. So all in all, that's why Enhancement during Mr. Pandaria is my choice. Next we have Evoker, World of Warcraft's fourth brand new class on the recent Dragonflight expansion. Now initially this class launched with two specializations, Devastation for DPS and Preservation for healing, but in patch 10.15 Blizzard dropped a third spec, Augmentation. This specialization would be unique in World of Warcraft as it wasn't just directly a healer or a tank or a DPS, it was a utility class which, well, augmented their allies' capabilities. Many other games and MMOs over the years have had this utility class fantasy, and usually it's a bard that does this. It's the guy who's chilling at the back of the group, dancing about, playing a lute or something. He's like your hype up guy, making your allies do what they do that bit better. Well, in World of Warcraft we have some dragon looking thing that sets you on fire and throws sand at you or something. I mean, hey, if it works, right? Anyways, this brand new edition was quickly adopted into both PvE and PvP. But where it really excelled was Mythic Plus. In this smaller scale environment, augmentation felt like it was an absolute necessity, both in terms of survivability and boosting your allies' damage. And everyone wanted an Aug Invoker for their Mythic Plus group, as well. Not only were they overtuned at launch, they just made you do so much more damage. And as we all know, more damage equals more fun. Season 2 of Dragonflight would see access to a God comp for Mythic Plus of Guardian Druid, Holy Paladin, Fire Mage, Shadow Priest, and an Augmentation Invoker, which totally dominated the patch, with people timing keys in the early 30s, and if we were to check Dragonflight Season 1 as a comparison, you can see how much more class variety there was. Also, the higher your key got, the value of Augmentation's ability to just make the party live through their shields, their CC, and just giving everyone a ton more versatility got more and more noticeable. In following patches, Blizzard would aim to tone down this new spec, and really a new role to World of Warcraft, but they remain a controversial pick. When augmentation is good, they're mandatory, and when they're bad, you just take another DPS. To this day, people argue whether augmentation was an innovation and that the support role should be embraced by more classes, or whether it was a mistake and it should be reworked into a more traditional healer. Either way, when augmentation was added into the game, things changed, and we're still feeling those effects now. Next, let's move on to the Leatherwearers, and we'll begin with the Druid. And for Druid, I'm going to go the state that they were in, specifically in PvP during Season 1 of Shadowlands. So one of the biggest and most controversial features of Shadowlands were Covenants. These new factions would grant you abilities upon siding with one of them, which, at least early on into the expansion, you couldn't change in any easy way, so you better have picked the right one. Upon siding with the Night Fae Druids, amongst other things, will be granted access to a new spell, Convoke the Spirits. This ability would fire off 16 random Druid spells over a 4-second duration. That's one spell per quarter of a second on a channeled cast. These random spells would be tailored to your specialization, but could include your hardest hitting abilities, which typically had cooldowns or you needed resources to use them. So when you press this button and the game decided to use your best abilities and have them crit, you could just absolutely erase people from the face of the game. And early on in Shadowlands, Shadowlands PvP, a druid could pop out of stealth and press convoke and easily global people before they had the chance to do anything about it. This had to have been one of the easiest one-button one-shots we've seen in a long time in PvP, and it makes me think back to the good old days of Pom Pyro mages. But whether it was open world, arenas or battlegrounds, a druid just appearing out of stealth and doing enough damage to kill your character 2 times over in 4 seconds was an absolute terror to behold. And that's why for druid I've got to pick Shadowlands Season 1 Convoke the Spirits. Next up I have Demon Hunter, and once again we're going to go more on the PvP side of things. And I'm going to be picking the state they were in during PvP throughout Dragonflight. What made them so good at this point in time was to get the basics down and put out a lot of damage. Demon Hunter was really simple to pilot, and at a basic level it always has been, to be fair, with most of their damage coming from abilities such as Blade Dance or I-Beam. So even if you're a bit more of a beginner to the PvP scene, you could get great results. A lot of PvP games over the years have had that one character that's really good when you're first getting into the game, but in Dragonflight Demon Hunter was that, as well as excelling at high rating as well. They had a lot of CC through both AoE stuns, single target stuns and imprison. They had good defensive options on short cooldowns. They would just heal a bunch by existing thanks to all their bonus leech. They were extremely mobile. They always have been, to be fair, but it's a nightmare trying to kite a Demon Hunter. They had reverse magic to turn CC effects back against enemies and just so much more going for them. And Blizzard would end up leaving Demon Hunter in a state where PvPers were calling for nerfs for months, as this class could do pretty much everything. But as we know, sometimes in World of Warcraft it takes Blizzard a while to get around to changing things when they're deemed overpowered by the community. And whilst Demon Hunters have definitely had their moments in PvP as well as PvE, for me the pick here has to be their states during Dragonflight in PvP. Next up we have Rogue, and it seems for the Leatherwearers so far, PvP content is dominating here. Now rogues are a class fantasy where a key part of it is, well, to not be fair in the first place. They play dirty and they don't adhere to any honourable rules, and this is especially true for player versus player combat. My pick for Rogue is going to be their state in vanilla for PvP. This is where the Rogue's toolkit could truly shine and they were able to pull off some incredible combos. The thing is about Rogues back then is, whilst in a great player's hands they looked absolutely unbeatable, it was easy to mess them up at the same time. You didn't have Shadow Step to instantly close the gap. You couldn't just Cloak of Shadows off mistakes or being caught. Being methodical and tracking cooldowns mattered, but all the same, Rogues could just kill your character before you even got a chance to play the game. Back in vanilla, long duration CC effects were long. Things weren't limited to 10 seconds as they were in the Burning Crusade and beyond, so when a rogue sapped you, you could just be standing there not able to do anything for 20 seconds plus. There was of course the standard cheap shot into kidney shot stunlock for a further 10 seconds of CC. They could throw in a Thistle Tea to their rotation to instantly regenerate all of their energy every so often for that extra little bit of burst, and this didn't even put their potion on cooldown either. Then of course you had Gouge to follow up, and when you talented this, it was another 5.5 seconds of CC. Don't forget about Blind either. In vanilla it was a bit different though. It was a poison effect where you had to create the reagents for it from Fade Leaf, meaning it did have more counterplay from poison dispelling effects and could be immuned off by Dwarves Racial Stone form. But on the other hand, it was an instant cast 10 seconds hard CC, and biggest of all, preparation in the subtlety tree reset the cooldowns on all rogue abilities, including blind. This changed in TBC because getting 2 blinds in one fight was very overpowered. Combine this with the fact that every other rogue you met was undead, and Vanilla Will of the Forsaken was a 2-minute cooldown racial that removed fear and charm effects and then made you immune to them afterwards for a short time, and didn't share a cooldown with a PvP trinket, and you end up with a class which can truly do some amazing things. It was a class that had a serious skill cap, but when played right, there were very few specs in the game that could beat it. Next I have Monk, and I have to be honest here, Monk is the class which I think it was the most difficult to find a properly overpowered state. Even during their release expansion in Mists of Pandaria, they tended to be pretty fair across all of their specs. But for Monk, I think one of their best spots has to have been for Brewmasters during BFA. It's a bit of a lesser remembered expansion for sure, but arguably it was when Brewmaster monks found their best representation as a tank, at least in raiding throughout all versions of World of Warcraft that they've existed in. During Battle for Azeroth, Monk's key damage mitigation tool Stagger underwent a bit of a rework. So Stagger had been a key part of Brewmaster's kit for a long time, and would cause some of their damage to be taken instantly and some of it over time, affecting both physical and magical damage. Managing your Stagger was key to playing a monk well, as taking too much damage and having your Stagger stack up too much would really start to stress your healers out, so you needed to manage your cooldowns, especially Purifying Brew, really well, and this brew would cancel out 40% of your active Stagger. At least it was that much in BFA. The big deal in this expansion was that your Stagger was changed to be based off of a percentage of your agility instead of a flat amount, so as your gear improved, your mitigation improved. At the start of BFA it was based off 140% of your agility, and then by 8.1 it had already been nerfed down to 105%, and then all the way down to 90% by patch 8.3. But Monk at the time was the premier tank, especially on progression encounters, because their damage intake was just so smooth, and when you're tanking or healing mythic raiding, you want a tank whose health bar is going to be predictable. You don't want one that's going to be going up and down all the time too much, and Brewmaster really was able to do that during BFA, so for me that's why I'm picking Brewmaster in Battle for Azeroth. Finally, we have the cloth wearers. We'll begin with the priest, and I'm going to be picking Shadow at the start of Legion. So Legion saw huge class changes for many different classes. Demonology Warlock became all about summoning armies of demons, Survival Hunter became melee, and Shadow Priest got access to a brand new resource, Insanity. It was also in Legion when you got a certain artifact weapon as a Shadow Priest, who I hear has kind of become a big deal nowadays in the War Within. One of the new talents added in Legion was called Surrender to Madness. This has to have been one of the most equally fun, broken, and completely unbalanceable talents Blizzard ever put in the game, but for a moment it was fantastic. Usually Shadow Priest gameplay in Legion involved activating Void Form through Void Eruption and maintaining your new resource bar Insanity as long as you possibly could through your rotation, and whilst you were in this Void Form you had a damage buff and a constantly stacking haste buff, but also while you're in Void Form your Insanity is draining faster and faster, so eventually you can't keep up anymore and you drop back into your regular Shadow form before setting up your next Void Form rotation. Now what Surrender to Madness did on its first version was completely change how you play Shadow Priest. So when you press the button it would instantly activate Void Form. Your Insanity generating abilities would generate 200% the regular amount, and you could cast whilst moving. But if you ever ran out of Insanity and left a Void Form, your character would instantly die. Horribly, as the tooltip says. And during the Race to World First of the Emerald Nightmare, the shortest Race to World First ever for a mythic raid, it was cleared in 18 hours by the way, we got to see how comically broken this spec really was. Shadow Priests were finding times during fights where there was just always something to hit, so even though they had Surrender to Madness running, they weren't at risk of dropping out of Void Form and losing their Insanity ever. Where usually a 30 to 40 second Void Form could be pretty good, with Surrender to Madness they were staying in Void Form for entire minutes at a time, and the best Shadow Priests were doing double, if not triple, what other classes could do on certain bosses. Blizzard had to hotfix Surrender to Madness 1 month after release to nerf its bonus Insanity regen from 200% down to 150%, before nerfing it even harder later in the expansion to just a 100% bonus. They tried to redesign this ability in BFA before eventually just removing the talent. I think it was a bit too problematic to ever get in a balanced state. I guess we all should have known Xal'atath was going to be a pretty powerful character when her weapon was capable of doing this at the start of Legion, but for me that's got to be the pick for the priest. Next up I have Mage, and I'm picking their state during Hellfire Citadel and Warlords of Draenor. So WoD is generally an expansion that people look down upon, but for one class and spec it delivered some truly memorable moments. A new talent Mages had in Warlords of Draenor was Prismatic Crystal. You put a crystal down and it would take 30% 30% bonus damage over its duration split to nearby targets. The second consideration here was a new trinket from Hellfire Citadel called Prophecy of Fear. This made direct attacks proc a burst of damage around its targets. Now most casters could land a hit every few seconds, but Arcane Mage had Arcane Missiles, which hit many times in a row, making Mage be able to benefit from this proc way more than other casters. Also in Warlords of Draenor, there was a secondary stat called Multi-Strike. This stat was exclusive to this expansion and is easy to overlook and forget about, but it gave attacks a chance to hit 2 more times at 30% of their original power, leading to some pretty extreme RNG pull-to-pull during this expansion. You combine this with all your endgame gearing and other buffs and consumables and so on during Warlords of Draenor, and if there was a boss that kind of just stood there and you can hit it for the full duration of Prismatic Crystal, what Arcane was capable of doing is completely insane. Raids back then could stack Arcane Mages and take down current content mythic bosses in 20 seconds or less because of the amount of damage they were doing thanks to all these factors. If you look at the top 1% of DPSs in Hellfire Citadel Mythic, you can see how far ahead Arcane was compared to everyone else. And if we check Iron Reaver specifically, a boss that Arcane was particularly good on, well, the DPS breakdown here almost looks as balanced as vanilla. Almost. So that's why for me, Arcane Mage in Hellfire Citadel has to be the pick for this class. Last but not least, we have the Warlock, and for me there's only one period in time which I can pick for the Warlock, and that is Mists of Pandaria. Oftentimes in this video it's been about a particular spec for a class that's been overpowered. For Mists of Pandaria, it was the entire class for the entire expansion. Destruction underwent changes and got access to Burning Embers, and the version of Chaos Bolt you probably remember where it always crits. Affliction later on in the expansion was an absolute beast of a spec on single target and multi-target fights because they could spread and maintain their dots so much easier. They also got access to Malefic Grasping Mop, a channel type effect which would cause your dots to do bonus damage when it ticked. But the star of the show for Warlocks and Mists of Pandaria has to have been Demonology. It was a totally unique version of this spec which had a highly involved playstyle, needed fight knowledge, and some real min-maxing to get the most out of it. Eventually Blizzard would nerf Demonology into the ground, and we had a rather famous interview and quote come out of it where Ian Hazzikostas straight up said, "We'd rather you didn't play Demonology." But what made Demo so unique in Mists of Pandaria? Well, first of all was a new resource called Demonic Fury that was gained through your standard abilities. You could then toggle Metamorphosis on as it had a really short cooldown, and your Demonic Fury would begin to drain as well as be spent on powerful abilities. This meant Warlocks could build up resources for when they needed them and then unleash tons of damage on single target or an AoE. Oh, and also during MOP you could cast your filler spells whilst moving thanks to a new talent, Killjaden's Cunning. There was also one trinket in particular which was crazy overpowered with how Demonology worked, called the Unerring Vision of Lei Shen. Any version of this trinket was better than any other trinket for a time. It would give your spells a 100% chance to crit for a few seconds, but in Mists of Pandaria you could snapshot spells. So for example, if you refresh your dots, and especially Doom during this proc, it would cause Doom to always crit during its duration, and every single time Doom crit, it spawned an imp, and those imps cast Fireball which gave you Demonic Fury. This interaction alone was super broken for Demonology. In fact, they had to nerf the trinket specifically for Warlocks because of this. But wait, there's more. There wasn't just one demon form in Mists of Pandaria, there were two. Whilst Metamorphosis was more for damage, there was also a glyph called Demon Hunting, which would unlock an alternative form called Dark Apotheosis. Unlike Meta, this was a permanent transform, and in this form you would take less physical and magical damage, as well as generating a ton more threat. Now this wasn't really intended to be a full-on tank spec, despite it mysteriously having some massive threat modifier, but you could make it work on some of the easier content in the game if you just wanted to have fun and see how it played out. This spec was also experimented with during PvP for Mists of Pandaria as well, and Dark Apotheosis was just a bit of fun really from a major glyph, but it was just something else the Mists of Pandaria Warlock had access to. But all in all, Mists of Pandaria was just a great time to play Warlock. Later on, of course, as I mentioned, Demonology would be nerfed to the ground, before in Legion, Demon Hunters came along and took Metamorphosis as an ability. Well, whilst the demo lock would transform and be more about summoning tons of demons rather than being one themselves. And I didn't even mention in Mr. Pandaria, it was when you had the quest to go and get green fire as well. So overall for Warlock, it just has to be Mr. Pandaria, but more specifically, demonology during this expansion. Combat and World of Warcraft go hand in hand, whether it's PvP, defeating the latest raid boss, or just being out there farming some gold. It's something that we all have tons of experience with just through playing the game. And World of Warcraft is a game that has embraced the holy trinity of combat within MMOs as well, that being we have classes that heal, ones that tank, and ones that DPS. Each spec has their designated roles by Blizzard, and that's what they do. Or is it? Over the years, people have experimented with different class abilities, talents, and gear options to the extent where they found different and brand new ways to play their class, which oftentimes don't appear to be the obviously dev-intended way to do so. And that is what I want to talk about today, one weird or unusual way to play each class within the game that's been done in a way which defies the meta and what is expected of that particular class or spec. Now, as you'll soon hear about, more often than not, these unusual player-made creations came out during the earlier versions of World of Warcraft, and this was largely down to the old unrestricted talent trees where you could put points wherever you wanted, and primary stats and a few other factors were different then, which made things generally a bit more flexible. As such, I'll be leaving out the Monk, Demon Hunter and Evoker for this, but if you do know of any off-meta playstyles for these classes which you think would have fit, let me know for sure, because for the other classes I had more than a few choices, and we can always do a part 2. But with all that said, let's begin and go over one off-meta spec for each class throughout World of Warcraft's history. Starting off with the plate wearers, we have the Warrior. For Warrior, I picked a unique spec that this class had during one expansion, a lesser played expansion for sure, Warlords of Draenor, and here I'm of course talking about Gladiator Stance. Gladiator Stance was a new talent added for protection warriors, which would basically aim to take the whole protection spec and instead of it being a tank, turn it into a DPS instead. When you pick this talent, it would increase physical damage by 20%, and replace your shield block with shield charge, which when used would increase the damage of shield slam, revenge and heroic strike by 30% for 6 seconds. It was such a cool class fantasy to be a shield wearing DPS for once, and not something we'd seen before in World of Warcraft. But this spec ended up having problems. First of all, for a DPS spec, it just wasn't very good compared to Arms or Fury when it came to doing damage on a warrior, and that went for both PvE and PvP. And if we look back to Warcraft logs and check out the top 5% of how people performed on each spec, Gladiator Warrior is not sitting too favourably on any of these lists for the raid tiers that WoD had, with both Fury and Arms oftentimes being far ahead of this new class identity. And picking a spec which is sitting so far below your other options really just isn't a choice a lot of people are going to make more than once. Blizzard would give some context as to why they removed this talent when they did so in Legion, roughly saying that leaving Glad Stance as a sub-spec of a talent tree restricted how much they could really do with it, and it created a conflict between building a defensive protection warrior spec and an offensive shield-wearing warrior spec. Now I think the obvious comparison here is Feral from Vanilla to Kata, where both DPS and tanking worked in the same talent tree, but by Warlords of Draenor of course you only get 1 talent point per 15 levels instead of 1 per level, so a lot of your class's baseline power had to be obtained when you first picked your spec. Then again, recently in Season of Discovery, Blizzard have brought back the fan favourite of Gladiator Warrior. So is it doing better in Molten Core at all? Well, when I went to check it out, it was not even listed as a DPS spec. So I'm going to go ahead and say it's probably not doing so hot, and people are just playing Fury and Vanilla as they always have done. At this point, Gladiator Warrior probably does need a full-on 4th spec if it's ever going to properly work, but for a time the Gladiator Warrior, this shield-wielding DPS spec, was a thing, and maybe one day it will be a thing again. For Paladin, there was a unique spec during Wrath of the Lich King which would prove an amazing hybrid between a DPS and a healer called the Preg Paladin. It was named after the player who supposedly invented it. This variation of Paladin was a mix between retribution and protection, and would really lean into the Paladin's hybrid identity, whilst also putting out some great damage and heals. The big difference between this and your standard rep pally was that instead of using a two-handed weapon, you did in fact rock a shield and a fast one-handed weapon for damage. Over in the Retribution tree, the talent The Art of War would give you an instant cast Exorcism or Flash of Light every single time your melee attack crit, and with a fast one-handed weapon and the Reckoning talent in the prot tree, this thing would proc basically non-stop, so you had loads of instant casts. You would be using Judgment and Shield of the Righteous for your main damage sources, and it still had all that great paladin utility from Hand of Protection, Freedom, Hammer of Justice, and so on. And this spec could absolutely bully melee-focused comps due to its high sustained damage output, as well as, well, it was kind of a tank at the same time. It was just really difficult to do damage to them. Even during Wrath Classic, this spec found a whole bunch of viability in PvP and could be a real annoyance to deal with due to their ability to be a true hybrid between a DPS and a healer. In Kata though, paladins changed a bunch and got holy power, which modified how they dealt damage, and you couldn't just put talents wherever you wanted anymore. You had to have spent a full 31 points before unlocking your other two specs to spend your remaining points. So in short, this spec just didn't make sense anymore. But during Wrath, Paladin had one of the most true, unique hybrid specs we have ever seen for PvP. Staying with the plate wearers, we have the Death Knight as well as another entry from the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, and that is for Blood Death Knight DPS. Early on in Wrath of the Lich King, as you may well know, Death Knights were truly on a different level to every other class. They were Blizzard's hero class after all, and it really felt like you were playing a cheat character that you unlocked after having beat the game or something. Early on, each spec didn't have their roles set in stone, so of course people experimented with different ways to play this new class, and one of those more successful experimentations early on was for Blood DPS. In terms of what abilities they used, it's pretty similar to what Blood DK ended up being in Wrath Classic, with their diseases, Death Coil as a spender, and of course most of the time you spammed Heart Strike, which for some reason stopped the target from benefiting from haste effects instead of cleaving nearby targets. But the biggest deal for the old Blood DK was Dancing Rune Weapon. Dancing Rune Weapon was why this spec did damage, and the first version of it that we had was crazy good. First of all, Dancing Rune Weapon would snapshot all of your active buffs, and you wanted to have as many buffs as possible before you activated it. It also had its duration extended based upon how much runic power that you spent on it, instead of lasting a fixed duration, so you really needed to set everything up at the start of the fight. It also copied everything that you did, including Raise Dead and even Army of the Dead, but biggest of all is that it dealt the exact same damage that the Death Knight did. In a later patch, Blizzard would nerf it so it copied 50% of the damage, but back during the start of Wrath, Dancing Rune Weapons straight up just doubled your damage. You combine this with a frankly very undertuned tier 8 and a revisit from Naxxramas where bosses just fell over, and DKs ended up with high uptime on their cooldowns because of this, so this would often see them towards the top of DPS meters alongside other burst heavy classes and specs such as the Arcane Mage. And we absolutely did not get this experience in Wrath Classic. With final patch balancing, Death Knights were a whole different beast than what they were in 2008. So was Blood DK just a total meme in Wrath Classic then? I mean, well, kind of, yeah. It was never the best DPS spec at any point for Death Knights to go to, but as we progressed through the tiers, it did start to improve, with the first time of it showing signs of life being during Trial of the Grand Crusader, and by Icecrown Citadel, with a Shadowmourne, it was actually doing fairly respectable damage. Wasn't topping the meters by any means, but they could definitely pull their weight. Of course, in Cataclysm, Blizzard would redesign Blood DK into the official tanking spec, which, to be fair, it already was for the vast majority of players in Wrath, but for a while, a long time ago, Blood DK was genuinely a top tier DPS. Let's stay in Wrath of the Lich King, shall we? Those big talent trees led to so much experimentation, and that was true for our first male-wearing class, the Enhancement Shaman. So Enhancement's always been a mix between physical and magical damage, and it really leaned into that class fantasy during Wrath of the Lich King when it came to certain gearing options. The first variation of Enhancement was known as Spellhance. What this meant is instead of your gearing being focused around agility and attack power based stats, certain item slots could contain caster items, notably your main hand and off pieces such as as your neck, rings and cloak. On top of that, early on in Wrath Classic, people playing Spellhance didn't even use Wind Fury weapon on their main hand. Instead, they favoured 2 different ranks of Flame Tongue weapon between their offhand and main hand to maximise on its spell damage scaling, as well as to take advantage of Glyph of Flame Tongue for extra crit bonus. This spec would also boast good AoE through Fire Nova, as well as spending Maelstrom procs on Chain Lightning. Of course, some of the BIS pieces were incredibly contested by basically every single caster already, so getting your hands on items such as the Ring of Manifested Pain from Kel'Thuzad or Dying Curse were not going to be easy, and in fact would probably cause a lot of drama, but the results that Spellhance could put out were solid, with it often being a class that found them towards the upper end of damage meters. And BIS gear throughout Wrath of the Lich King 4 enhancement kept featuring spell power items too, which really pushed this unique gearing style. But wait, there is more. There was also another Shaman variation experimented with called Heal Hands, where the idea was to utilize major glyphs and Maelstrom procs on healing abilities rather than always spending them on damage. This was more of a flex pick between a DPS and a healer, where it enabled the Shaman to be a true hybrid between the two, but if for whatever reason you just needed a bit of extra heals here and there, this spec could very much work, though Heal Hands really excelled in content which you already overgeared a decent amount and didn't need as many on-demand heals to really require another full-on healer. All the same, Wrath had both Spellhance and Heal Hands, and I think they're both worthy of a mention. Next up is the Hunter, and for them I'm picking a playstyle which really only existed during Vanilla and TBC called Melee Weaving. So back in these first 2 versions of World of Warcraft, the Hunter's ranged and melee swing timers were tracked separately. This meant you could shoot your ranged weapon, run into melee during which time your ranged weapon swing timer is recovering, hit your melee attack or raptor strike, run back out, use your next ranged auto attack, and repeat as of when needed. There were some variables on this too, such as your melee and ranged weapon speeds, haste procs, and various other effects which complicated your swing timer, which made effective melee weaving have an extremely high skill cap, but when executed well, it was truly a thing of beauty to watch. In fact, when people talk about specs which are difficult to play in the early versions of World of Warcraft, I think a melee weaving Hunter in TBC is genuinely the most difficult, despite it never really being talked about all that much. Now, as much as melee weaving was possible in Vanilla, it was never really popular for several reasons. One reason was, Hunters kind of just did damage in Molten Core and then they fell off really hard scaling wise. And for you to melee weave effectively, you needed a spot in a group with Wind Fury, which means you're competing for that spot with all your guild's rogues and warriors. And both of them could do a lot more damage with a lot less effort. And you needed Wind Fury because, kind of goes without saying, but if you're melee weaving, you always want a slow two-handed weapon, so when you do step into hit, you're getting as much damage as possible. The bigger reason though was just the downtime which it caused in Vanilla. In Vanilla, ranged attacks needed you to be 8 yards away from your target, and to melee be within 5 yards. So each melee weave really needed you to take a few steps forwards and then run all the way back out again, which was just barely worth the effort even if done near perfectly, because ranged weapons of course don't fire when you're moving. However, in TBC, Blizzard changed the minimum range of ranged weapons down from 8 yards to 5. Yes, it says 5 for both melee and ranged, but there is a very small difference between the two. This meant now you could just tap forwards and then tap backwards to melee weave, and it was very effective if done well. But of course, back then TBC Hunters also had to deal with Steady Shot, which had to be weaved in between your regular auto attacks. So you had your ranged weapon swing timer, your Steady Shot, your melee swing timer, and your Raptor Strike cooldown, which you needed to balance out whilst also taking into account haste effects as well. The upside in TBC was, unlike Vanilla, Hunters did damage now, and with a very high level of melee weaving, they were pretty hard to beat, until you got to a boss with an absolutely terrible hitbox of course, and unfortunately there was a lot of those. Either way, melee weaving Hunters were a unique and powerful way to play the class, which for me definitely peaked in TBC. On to our leather-wearing classes next, and we will begin with the Rogue. A role that Rogue could find itself in during earlier versions of World of Warcraft could be of that of a tank. Now this wasn't exactly commonplace by any means. You wouldn't really sign up to a guild saying I'm a rogue tank and expect to be accepted. And we aren't talking about Season of Discovery here either, where Blizzard have made rogue tank into an official thing. This is rogue tank that just so happens to work purely via the circumstances. And the circumstances in question were A, the boss kind of just stands there and auto-attacks you, and B, you have loads of gear and enough combined dodge and parry to ensure that you never take a direct hit, and for all intents and purposes you're a tank that's immune to damage. In fact, there have been kills of bosses in Naxxramas on hardcore realms using rogue tanks because they're just the most consistent tank. The bosses physically cannot hit them. Patchwork has been done with rogue tanks. Even Resuvius, who isn't supposed to be tanked, has been done with rogue tanks. And as long as your rogue can maintain a threat lead, it's very possible to have them fulfill this typically unavailable role to them. That being said, threat is the big problem here. See, as much as rogues can do good damage and therefore manage to generate a good amount of threat by themselves, they don't have the tools traditional tanks do, such as taunting abilities. So if a DPS messes up and overtakes you, it's kind of very difficult to fix the situation without just having a regular tank takeover. During the Burning Crusade, rogue tank was effective on some encounters too, especially Gruul the Dragon Slayer and Mother Shiraz in the Black Temple, where similar to Naxxramas, rogues could gear up enough to the point where they just straight up wouldn't be hit by auto attacks. In the Sunwell, rogues hypothetically would have been great on a number of fights too, but basically stat scaling was starting to get a bit out of hand, and even proper traditional feral druid tanks were hitting mitigation cap, or in other words, also becoming immune to auto attacks. Blizzard would end up putting an effect in the Sunwell called Sunwell Radiance, which gave enemies a 5% bonus to their hit chance and players a minus 20% to their dodge chance, which instantaneously killed any class fantasy the rogue tank had going. Even your regular tanks with full mitigation gear would get trucked by some bosses in the Sunwell. But rogue tank did used to be a thing even before Season of Discovery, and providing your DPS could hold on for them to build threat, they could be very effective. For druids, it's not so much an off-meta spec that I'm picking, but more just the steps that they went through if they wanted to really min-max their feral spec during vanilla, because it was pretty excessive. So ferals worked in an entirely different way to any other melee class back then, because they didn't actually auto-attack with their weapon. Instead, they had a set auto-attack speed depending whether they were in bear or cat form, and their auto-attack damage was based off their stats, rather than being largely impacted by their weapon's damage and speed. This meant for feral druids specifically, their weapon wasn't really very important to actually improving their damage, and there was one weapon in particular from Gnomeregan which ended up being the best thing ferals could equip right up to early game in the Burning Crusade. It is an infamous weapon by this point called the Manual Crowd Pummeler. Where it was special is that it had an on-use effect that would grant 50% bonus to attack speed for 30 seconds when used, so this would massively increase the feral druid's attack speed and provide a larger damage increase than any other weapon choice in the game. It was even the best for tanking too, as it would give the greatest threat per second. The kicker on this item though is that it was limited to 3 charges, so if you really wanted to min-max, you had to go and farm these from inside Gnomeregan from the boss, appropriately named the Crowd Pummeler. You could get to this boss pretty easily via the back door of Gnomeregan, and that's exactly what you had to do. Oh, and it wasn't a 100% drop chance either, and back then you could only do 5 instances per hour, so it was a big never-ending grind. But if you were min-maxing, that's just part of what you had to do, and that is not all you had to do either. Another technique that was used a lot was called power shifting. So back in vanilla, energy generation was different. Instead of it gradually regenerating by increments of 1 with its regeneration rate being affected by haste, instead you got 20 energy every 2-second intervals. And usually when you shift into cat form, you had 0 energy, but we can improve that. There are 2 things to take into account here. The Fura talent over in the feral tree that would guarantee 20 energy when going into cat, as well as the Wolf's Head Helm, an item that would mirror this effect. So now when you enter cat, you instantly gain 40 energy. and if you time this alongside the global energy tick, you'll more or less instantly be up to 60 energy, at which point you can shred twice in a row, exit cat, and re-enter before the next energy tick, and repeat this process. So in short, Power Shift is spamming exit and enter cat form to gain more energy than you would have done if you just waited for it to regenerate naturally. It was mana intensive, however, and would need to be done correctly to really see the benefits. But when it comes to min-maxing a certain spec, few classes and specs had to do more than Ferals did in vanilla. Finally, we have our cloth wearers with the Warlock first. Well, Season of Discovery may have made the Warlock tank into a real thing, but now and again the Warlock was called upon to tank certain raid encounters. But the Warlock tank combined the innate tankiness of this class alongside its bonus threat generating ability Searing Pain to allow certain bosses that needed a ranged tank to be possible. The first big hurdle for Warlock tanks to learn was the Twin Emperors in AQ40. These two bosses had to be split to either sides of the room, as if they were ever too close they would begin to heal up, and now and again throughout the fights they would teleport and swap position. There was also one caster boss and one melee one. The caster boss was the one the Warlock would be waiting for, and you'd also need to equip a bunch of shadow resist for this boss too, as their main attack hit pretty damn hard. There was the option to go and respec for this encounter to a demonology build where you could pick up talents that would give you 60 bonus shadow resist when using a Fell Hunter, and of course Soul Link to split a bunch of damage. But it was kind of unnecessary and would seriously impact your threat generation, and there was no dual spec back then of course, and you couldn't summon inside of instances either. So yeah, I always opted for just equipping a bunch of shadow resist and hoping the healers kept me alive. Another example of Warlock tanking was Leotheris the Blind during the Burning Crusade, where in his second phase he would transform into a demon and launch AoE fireballs at you. And early on, before people started to outgear this encounter, a lot of people opted for the Warlock tank here. It was a similar situation to Twin Emps, where you needed to put some resist gear on, fire resist this time, and then really just build threat with Searing Pain as much as possible. And even in ICC there was a boss fight that some guilds tried with a locked tank, that being the Blood Council, where one of the bosses launched shadow bolts which did huge amounts of damage, and you had to collect these orbs from around the room to reduce that damage taken. But in my opinion, doing this as a Warlock ended up being more trouble than it was worth, as a Blood DK could do it so much easier, and if anything ever went wrong they actually had cooldowns to press where they could live. But overall I enjoyed the flexibility and having the chance to really contribute something a bit more on different bosses now and then. It also made you think about gearing and how best to generate threat, such as lining a Doom tick up with when Leotheris would go into demon form. And lock tanking was just fun to do overall, so that's why I'm picking it here. For Priest I have a real mean spec, which has kind of never been all that good, but it's been something that people have experimented with time and again, and that is the Smite spec or Holy DPS Priest, whichever one you want to call it. Priest throughout vanilla and TBC had a bunch of talents in the Holy and Discipline tree, which straight up buff the damage of your Holy spells. These talents improve crit chance, flat damage increases, more spell damage, all of that kind of stuff. And it did seem as though the making of something was there, and people tried it out over the years to see if they could get it to work. In theory the spec was going to be super simple to play, I mean to be fair most casters were during these first two expansions, and that would involve pretty much just pressing Smite. Unfortunately this spec was, well, not very good, and it had a lot of problems. Your mana bar, first of all, it would run out really fast if you were spamming spells. You had 0 bonus hit chance from talents, and hit chance was a harder stat to find, especially early on in vanilla, and you didn't benefit from any of the major debuffs on bosses that people were going to be putting up. I mean, unless you had a Paladin judging Crusader for bonus holy damage, but that in itself was a rare thing, especially in vanilla. In TBC, Blizzard introduced a new and very interesting talent for the Smite Priest called Surge of Light, which was quite far down the holy tree. This would give you a chance for your next Smite to be instant cast after a spell crit, and during the early versions of this talent, the Smite proc could also crit, so you could get back-to-back procs and just spam instant cast smites one after the other. This also used to proc from using items too apparently. Unfortunately, Blizzard nerfed both of these interactions pretty early on into TBC, so the one talent that potentially had something going for Smite Priest became kind of just not very good anymore for anything. This kind of reminds me of the whole Gladiator Warrior situation, where if a proper holy DPS Priest was going to be a thing, it would probably need its own talent tree to be fully focused focused around that idea, the Inquisitor or something of the sort perhaps. Either way, Smite Priest has been something that's been tried out time and again throughout World of Warcraft, to very mixed results. Last but not least is the Mage, and Mage has had plenty of weird and wonderful specs over the various expansions, but the one that stands out to me as being both niche and amazing at what it did is most definitely the Pom Pyro Mage, aka the 3-minute Mage. This was a PvP spec which was mainly just for messing about in battlegrounds and seeing some massive crits, but there's just something about one-shotting someone with basically no chance at counterplay that just never felt as though it got old. This mage spec was most popular during vanilla and TBC, and the core of it was going down the arcane tree and picking up both arcane power and the presence of mind talents. Arcane power would give you 30% bonus damage, and presence of mind would make your next spell, which had under a 10-second cast time, instant. And both of these had a 3-minute cooldown, hence the name, the 3-minute mage. Of course, the only spell you wanted to send off instantly was Pyroblast over in the fire tree, which typically had a massive 6-second cast time. I mean, sometimes in PvP you could poly somebody and then hardcast a pyro, but other people could disrupt you, they may be able to trinket and so on. On top of that, if your Pyroblast crit, you had the Ignite talent too, meaning your target would take a bonus 40% of its damage over a few seconds. You'd of course always look to get the Berserking buff in Battlegrounds too, before finding an unlucky target to test all that damage on. You then put all this together in a macro with any spell power trinkets you had, and that's your Pom Pyro Mage, and the results speak for themselves. This spec definitely wasn't as strong as Frost outside of your cooldowns though, and you were really just invested in that big damage every 3 minutes. But for me, the Pom Pyro Mage has always been a core spec when it comes to PvP in the earlier versions of WoW. Throughout World of Warcraft's many expansions, we've seen class abilities come and go. Some of them were seen as relics of the past which were clunky to play with or just not very interactive, and others were the cornerstone of how certain specs had worked for many years. And with these changes now and again, sometimes Blizzard introduces spells or abilities to WoW which were perhaps just a little bit too good. Those abilities that can one-shot others in PvP, top DPS without trying, or make you feel more mobile than a mounted player. Today I wanted to cover one ability per class that was either removed from the game entirely or massively nerfed after players found out just how overpowered it was in the game. This can be any form of ability, talent, spell, artifact trait, or whatever else that your class has ever possessed at any point in WoW's 20+ year history. So with that said, this is the most overpowered removed ability from each of WoW's classes. I think today we'll start off with the Cloth Wearers and with the Priest. And to be fair, they are a pretty easy starting point because this class specifically had arguably one of the best DPS cooldowns that was ever introduced to the game. It was first added in Legion and it was called Surrender to Madness. So in Legion, Shadow Priest specifically got a pretty big overhaul to their gameplay style, where usually it was just about keeping dots up and using stuff off of cooldown. Now instead they had a brand new resource to play with called Insanity. Insanity would be generated through abilities and would drain after a priest had activated their Void form. Whilst in this Void form you would get some different abilities and would gain a damage buff and an ever stacking haste buff. So the general idea was pull your resources, activate Void form, and then try and stay in this form for as long as possible to make the most of the damage buffs it provided. And with your regular gameplay, depending on boss fights and how much you need to move, you'd be somewhere between a 30 to 45 second Void form duration. It was definitely a powerful ability, but it was fair as well. And that is where Surrender to Madness steps in and just completely breaks the class. Surrender to Madness instantly activated Void form and made it so all spells could be cast whilst moving. On top of that, in its first version, you would generate 200% bonus insanity from abilities whilst in Void form. There is a catch though, if your insanity ever dropped to 0 and you exited Void form, you just straight up died. You couldn't even be rezzed either. This was the ultimate risk versus reward DPS cooldown, and I don't know if anything quite as cool has been put in the game since. The thing is, in its first version, Surrender to Madness was just way overtuned. The combination of being able to cast whilst moving whilst generating all that bonus insanity meant that priests were able to keep in Void form more or less indefinitely as long as they had something to hit all of the time. And so the first raid tier of Legion opens, the Emerald Nightmare, and it becomes immediately apparent that this new class can have more or less 100% uptime on a bunch of raid bosses, leading to Shadow Priest absolutely crushing the DPS meter meters and clearly being the best DPS in the game. Of course though, Blizzard stepped in with a nerf to Surrender to Madness, many times over might I add. By patch 7.15, the insanity gain from this talent was halved down from 200% to 100%, and Void Form itself was targeted with nerfs to its insanity drain rate 3 times as well throughout Legion. Blizzard did have a few attempts at rebalancing Surrender to Madness in later expansions, but ultimately it was removed as we know it in Dragonflight. But for me, this is definitely the most overpowered ability that priests have ever had, which was unfortunately removed. Next we have the Mage, and for Mage they are a class that have had so many wacky abilities over the years, from Frostjaw as a combined 8-second root and silence on a low cooldown, have fun playing versus that one in PvP healers, or Prismatic Crystal in Warlords of Draenor, which enabled them to do crazy high burst DPS as Arcane and defeat bosses which were current content in literally seconds if you stacked enough mages. But for Mage, what I want to pick is something which, although was removed in future expansions, is still a talent in vanilla WoW, and that is the seemingly innocent improved Blizzard. I mean, it's a talent named after the game studio, you know it's got to be overpowered, right? So I've said in plenty of videos now that the Death Knight wasn't really World of Warcraft's first hero class when it came to just how overpowered they were. It all began with a Mage in vanilla. During this first version of WoW, when all classes were most certainly not made equal, they had a toolkit which was just several expansions ahead of others, and they excelled more than anyone else to an enormous degree in dealing AoE damage. Where other classes might have an ability which can hit a few targets such as cleave or multi-shot, or have an AoE on a long cooldown which was often just bad such as Hurricane or Volley, Mages had, well, they had everything. Arcane Explosion, Cone of Cold, Flame Strike, and Blizzard. Mages absolutely destroyed every other class on AoE, and it was just not close. And during vanilla, there was no cap on AoE damage. During TBC and Wrath, Blizzard actually began to tone down AoE damage by introducing a cap, where a single ability couldn't do more than a certain amount of total damage. But in vanilla, you deal full damage whether you're hitting 1 mob or 1,000 mobs. And this is where the talent improved Blizzard starts to come in. At max rank, it would slow enemies by 65% for 1.5 seconds, but you would also always be taking the Permafrost talent too, which improved the value of your slows by 10% and their duration importantly by 3 seconds. So any enemy that could be slowed by improved Blizzard was slowed by 75% for 4.5 seconds. And in vanilla, well, Blizzard didn't always make certain mobs such as elite or even in some cases dungeon mobs immune to slowing effects. So you combine the Mage's ability to hit an infinite number of enemies, to be able to permanently apply a massive movement speed slow so they never got hit, and just their good defensive tools from the Frost Tree such as Ice Barrier, Cold Snap and Ice Block, and you end up with vanilla Mage AoE farming where the sky is very much the limit. Mage's toolkit allows them to be the fastest leveler in the game through AoE farming in the open world. It allows them to boost themselves in dungeons such as Zul'Farrak, or of course even boost others in raids like Zul'Gurub. Mages can, no exaggeration, pull 500 mobs in Maradon at the same time and gradually AoE them down. In fact, recently there's even been talk of Mages soloing Lower Blackrock Spire, which is a new discovery on Anniversary Realms as far as I'm aware. Eventually though, Blizzard started to introduce AoE caps, which wasn't as bad as it sounds, but more importantly they just started making stuff in dungeons immune to slowing effects. Improved Blizzard is the talent though that really brought everything together to allow the Mage to pull off these crazy things in vanilla, and it truly set them apart from other classes. And for what it's worth, Mages could still AoE well in TBC, and I remember people boosting or leveling in the likes of Slave Pens, so this wasn't completely dead by the expansion. But this tactic and Mage's exclusive access to the best AoE really did start to fall off heavily by Wrath of the Lich King and beyond. For Warlock, they are another class with plenty of abilities in contention here, but for them I want to go with a talent which we will soon have access to in Mists of Pandaria Classic. However, we're going to get a nerfed version of it, and that is Kill Jaden's Cunning. So the one we should expect to get is one where Malefic Grasp, Shadow Bolt and Incinerate are all castable whilst moving. These are the filler spells for the 3 Warlock specs, and it's still a great talent overall because who doesn't love casting while moving? However, this talent used to be quite different. So during Mr. Pandaria's release in patch 5.04, it was a 1-minute cooldown ability which, when activated, allowed all spells to be cast whilst moving for 6 seconds. However, it also had a passive effect too, which meant if you cast spells without the cooldown active, it would slow your cast speed by 50% and movement speed by 10%, both of these stacking 2 times. So the upside was 6 seconds of casting while moving every 1 minute, and the downside was up to a 100% casting and 20% movement speed slow if accidentally used otherwise. I'm not gonna lie, this sounds pretty bad in its first version. However, then the first major content patch rolled around in 5.1 and straight up removed the cast time penalty from Killjaden's Cunning, but increased the movement speed slow to cap out from 30% up from 20%. So you still had the active portion of the talent with the free movement and casting for 6 seconds, but otherwise you could cast anything whilst moving, and the downside was a 30% slow debuff. Now that, on the other hand, sounds pretty amazing. Of course, this would have impacted you big time on fights where you did need a lot of mobility, but in Mr. Pandaria you have the active to cancel the slow, you had Demonic Circle, and you also have Demonic Gateway and Burning Rush in Mr. Pandaria too, so you very much had the tools to overcome this small downside. Patch 5.2 removed the active part of Killjaden's Cunning and just keeping it entirely passive, and finally patch 5.4 changed it to what you should expect to get in Mr. Pandaria Classic. So really, this talent lasted from 5.1 to 5.4 in all of its glory, and must be one of the most powerful talents WoW has ever seen. Next up is Rogue, and for them I picked a talent that we will be seeing during Mr. Pandaria, and you will be getting it at its best possible version. Usually things on final patches have undergone 1 or 2 nerfs after starting off being too good, but in this case more or less every single major content patch in Mr. Pandaria buffed this ability until we end up with what we'll have today, and here I'm talking about Burst of Speed. During Mr. Pandaria, this is an ability with no cooldown that costs 15 energy, increases movement speed by 70% for 4 seconds, and removes all movement speed slowing effects. So between the energy cost and the uptime, this ability can always be active for a small investment of your energy for a really powerful effect. And looking back through the older patch notes, the first version of this seemed to cost 60 energy, didn't remove slowing effects, and it broke stealth. I guess Blizzard was seriously overestimating how good a mini on-demand sprint was going to be. Burst of Speed though is just a great overall tool for the rogue, whatever area of content you enjoy most. For leveling, it's going to be faster than mounting up between short distances. For PvP, it removes roots and gives you a nice speed boost. For PvE, it's a small energy investment to cover a lot of ground fast. And for farming old content, you can zoom through dungeons with a permanent 70% movement speed buff. This talent was also nerfed twice in Warlords of Draenor to increase its energy cost to 30, as well as to make it have a 3-second cooldown before it was outright removed in Legion. So back in the day, you'd have had this talent in this state for most of the final patch of Mr. Pandaria, which was still a very long time by the way, but in Mock Classic you'll have this from day 1, so rogues, enjoy. We're staying in the Mr. Pandaria expansion for the next ability on this list, with an absolutely iconic druid ability that only existed for this expansion. I am of course talking here about Symbiosis. The idea behind this spell is pretty simple. So the druid will cast Symbiosis on another class. The druid gains an ability from that class based upon the casting druid spec, and the class they have casted Symbiosis on gains a druid ability which can depend on their spec, but some classes get the same ability for all 3 specs. Just for an example, if you're a Resto Druid and you Symbiosis as Shadow Priest, the Druid gets a Leap of Faith and the Priest gets Tranquility. If you're a Feral Druid and you put Symbiosis on a Prot Pala, the Druid will get Divine Shield and the Paladin gets Bark Skin. And if you Symbiosis any Hunter as a Balanced Druid, the Druid will get Misdirection, and any Hunter specs will get Dash. Just keep in mind what spec you target with Symbiosis doesn't matter, it's just the ability granted will change based upon your own spec. So of course this opened up a massive amount of different combinations which can be applied to so many different scenarios in all areas of the game. In PvP specifically, you really had to learn the Symbiosis combinations. A Feral Druid could just use Dispersion out of nowhere, and you might not have expected that extra defensive when you're going all in. In PvE, it opened up a bunch of powerful abilities which could be shared too, depending on the requirements of the fight. Maybe a single player needed a defensive, or the raid needed more healing, perhaps perhaps more mobility would be good, or you could even misdirect from a druid's starfall. There were so many possibilities, and you better believe because of this it was a bit of a balancing nightmare, and B, kind of complicated to understand from a player perspective. The total amount of abilities which Symbiosis could grant between every different possible combination was 66. So at the start of Warlords of Draenor, Blizzard pruned this ability, alongside many others then I might add, and it hasn't been seen again since. But if you do intend to give MMORPG Classic a try, you'll be able to experience Symbiosis once again. Next up on the leather wearers is the Monk, and funnily enough it's another ability from Mists of Pandaria. I swear I'm not picking MMORPG on purpose here, but when people think back to it and say classes were fun back then, that kind of happened for a reason. There was just a lot of overpowered stuff. Anyways, the choice for me here is a Brewmaster Monk ability, Dizzying Haze. This ability costs 20 energy, had a 40-yard range, applied a 50% slow for 15 seconds, and would hit all enemies within an 8-yard radius, dealing high threat. In Mists of Pandaria as well, it also gave enemies essentially a 3% chance to punch themselves in the face instead of you. So this ability might not sound as though it's the biggest deal compared to some of the other ones we've already seen here, but this is a spammable ranged AoE threat generator that applies a 50% slow. Has any other tank in WoW ever had something like this? Maybe they have, but not that I can think of, and that's probably for a good reason. During Mists of Pandaria and beyond, Blizzard started working on making dungeons a bit more competitive too through challenge modes. Imagine this ability in Modern Mythic Plus with its capabilities of pulling so many mobs whilst having a built-in way to kite at the same time. It was also amazing just for general open world use or farming old content, and since Wrath of the Lich King, even hitting a mob with a non-damaging attack would grant you a tag on it. So this was just overall a fantastic ability with so many different use cases for the Monk. Dizzying Haze existed all the way through Warlords of Draenor 2, though enemies having a chance to hit themselves was removed, before ultimately Dizzying Haze was removed entirely in Legion. But again in MMORPG Classic, you'll get the chance to try out this ability once again. Finally, for the leather wearers is the Demon Hunter, and for them I want to do a throwback to their release expansion, Legion. For Demon Hunter I'm picking what used to be their artifact weapon ability for Havoc, the Fury of the Illidari. Every class's artifact ability was something pretty amazing back then, but Fury of the Illidari definitely stood out. What it did was pretty simple. On a 1-minute cooldown, do a massive amount of AoE damage to all nearby targets. Demon Hunters, especially in Legion, had a very strong AoE damage profile between their artifact ability, Blade Dance and I-Beam, and both in Mythic Plus and raid bosses which required AoE, they definitely excelled. And at a 1-minute cooldown, this ability felt as though it was nearly always ready to go whenever you were pulling a lot of enemies. Blizzard did end up removing Fury of the Illidari at the start of BFA, alongside many other Legion artifact powers and abilities, but they did kind of bring it back in Shadowlands with a new ability called Glaive Tempest. However, Glaive Tempest just didn't do anywhere near as much damage, it cost resources, and it was target capped, so it was a far cry from how powerful Fury of the Illidari felt to use. Overall though, Legion brought a ton of fun abilities into the game through artifact weapons, and for their opening expansion, the Demon Hunter got a particularly good one. Now we're moving on to the Mail Wearers, and the first one up is the Hunter. The ability I want to highlight for them is one that actually exists in Cataclysm, which was temporarily removed in Mists of Pandaria before being brought back in Warlords of Draenor and its most powerful form. It's usually the case with Warlords of Draenor that Blizzard were removing abilities or pruning things out of your spellbook, but in this case Hunter's got something back, and that was Aspect of the Fox. So in Kata you may know this as simply allowing you to cast Steady Shot and Cobra Shot whilst moving, and this was the case in Mists of Pandaria for a bit too, but Blizzard made a change so you can cast these while moving baseline without needing Fox active, and that was when they temporarily removed it. In Warlords of Draenor though, Aspect of the Fox was no longer a passive buff as Hunter aspects tend to be, and instead it was redesigned into a cooldown, a seriously powerful cooldown at that. On a 3-minute cooldown when activated, it would allow all raid members within 40 yards to be able to cast whilst moving for 6 seconds, and certain boss fights in Warlords of Draenor, such as Black Hand Phase 1 on Mythic, had your whole raid need to move during the same time as a group while still taking tons of damage. So to have 0 zero downtime on DPS or heals whilst dodging the mechanics was a very big deal on some fights, perhaps more so than anyone for healers who are typically a little less mobile while pressing their big healing buttons. Aspect of the Fox allowed players to coordinate and overcome mechanics in perhaps a way that Blizzard weren't entirely happy with, and it even seemed as though in the future some fights may require X number of Fox casts to overcome difficult portions of them. But Aspect of the Fox in this state didn't even last the whole way through the Warlords of Draenor expansion, and was removed in patch 6.2 Hellfire Citadel. Nevertheless, for a time, Hunters had perhaps their most valuable bit of raid-wide utility ever, and it all happened during Warlords of Draenor. Next up is the Evoker, because we are covering all classes here. Still, as a more recent addition to WoW, they haven't had as many iterations over the years, and haven't had as many chances to just do overpowered things. But I know what remove thing I want to pick from the Evoker here, because it's very much changed how much one of their specs has started to be picked. So back in Dragonflight midway through the expansion, Evoker was given a third spec, Augmentation, or just Aug for short. An Aug is unlike many other specs in the game. It's not a pure DPS, a tank, or a healer, but it's a support spec that buffs others in their party or raid. And when people got to grips with this new spec and saw what it was capable of doing, it was adapted into the game very fast, and it was soon proving itself as part of a comp which was clearly head and shoulders above anything else at high level in Mythic Plus. And whilst Aug was also great, it was problematic. When Aug was good, it felt super overpowered, and when Aug was bad, it was really bad. And it seems as though Blizzard are still to strike a balance where a support spec can feel healthy for the game, especially at higher levels of gameplay. But this brings me to what has been removed from Augmentation to see a big drop off and play, and that was a targeted change to the spec in patch 11.1 of the War Within, where they can no longer buff tanks or healers, meaning all their supportive capabilities are on far less players. And if you check the current Mythic Plus season or the overall passes from Undermine Heroic, this is the least played spec in the game by a very big margin. It's the same story on Mythic too, by the way. So it seems as though this change has temporarily pretty much removed Augmentation as a spec from existence, which seems like a rather big thing to have lost out on. You do wonder if they'll wait 12 months and then just rebuff Aug to let them have fun again, or perhaps the support spec is just always going to have its ups and downs, and we'll have to see how Blizzard changes this in the future. The last of the male classes is the Shaman, and for them I want to talk about a pretty big downgrade in the mobility of Elemental, but also of Restoration 2 in certain circumstances, and that was their loss of the ability to cast Lightning Bolt whilst moving. So if you played Elemental in Cataclysm at all, you'll know there's a glyph called Unleash Lightning, which simply allows the Lightning Bolt to be cast whilst moving. Of course, this is your main filler spell, and it's great to be able to use this while still moving in all areas of content. In patch 5.3 during Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard changed this glyph and just made Lightning Bolt castable whilst moving baseline as a thing that the Shaman could now do. In fact, this may have been influenced by the fact that another caster, the Warlock, as we've already talked about, at this point in time was able to do their entire rotation on the move. So really, what is being able to cast one spell in comparison to that? Mists of Pandaria was a time of crazy mobility in the game, especially for casters, and Lightning Bolt whilst moving was a perfect example of that. Eventually, at the start of WoD in 6.02, Blizzard straight up removed the ability for Lightning Bolt to be cast on the move, and it set you back several expansions on mobility, where again you had to have your feet planted in order to use this ability. I mean, at least you still had Spirit Walker's Grace for some temporary movement, which is better than nothing. But I think because of how gameplay changing it was, that Lightning Bolt on the move baseline for Shaman is the pick here. Whilst back in the day this was possible without a glyph from patch 5.3, that's the patch between Throne of Thunder and Siege of Orgrimmar, in MOC Classic you should have this ability from day one, so again that's something to look forwards to for the Shaman players. And now we are onto the plate wearers with the Paladin up first. For them I'm picking a talent which only worked this way during the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, and that is Sacred Cleansing. So PvP in WoW changed a lot from TBC to Wrath of the Lich King, with Blizzard removing a ton of RNG effects from Arena, ranging from environmental environmental hazards, stun resist, spell knockback changes, and loads more. Across the world, from open world to battlegrounds to the arena, PvP interactions were going to be a bit more consistent and expected, rather than getting super unlucky or lucky being the deciding factor in whether you win any given battle. This all sounds great, and though it's going to be leading to a more competitive and healthy PvP scene as a whole. And then Blizzard go and, for some inexplicable reason, add one of the most RNG heavy talents into the game we've ever seen in Sacred Cleansing. This will give your cleanse effect a 30% chance upon dispel to increase the target's chance to resist disease, magic and poison effects by 30% for 10 seconds. So you could randomly dispel, well, just about anything, and have a chance to make the target have a much higher chance to resist future spells. Imagine removing any of Mage's Slow on a warrior, and then they have a 30% extra chance to resist Nova or Deep Freeze. When Sacred Cleansing procced, it could absolutely turn a fight purely on RNG, and this was an expansion where they aimed to remove so much of PvP's randomness. On top of this, the Holy Paladin was already S tier in absolutely everything in Wrath of the Lich King, and were often found in top arena teams and were stacked in raids, so you were going to be seeing a lot of this class as well. In Kata, this talent was reworked now just to add a magic dispel effect back to cleanse because it didn't do this baseline anymore. But for Wrath of the Lich King, especially for PvP, Sacred Cleansing was just a strange talent for Blizzard to have added, but was ultimately a very powerful one. Next we have the Death Knight, and you already know when we're talking most overpowered in Death Knight, it's going to have to be something from their release date at the start of Wrath of the Lich King. It's no exaggeration that the release DK was a true hero class and was just miles ahead of any other class at doing, well, anything to be honest. You could very much DPS as any of the 3 specs, or you could tank as any of the 3 if you wanted. People would run 5 DKs through TBC dungeons when they were leveling and just absolutely flatten them. In Arena, people reach Gladiator in blue gear, and others use cast random macros with their abilities to just let fate decide their rotation. So this means there's going to be quite a lot of choice for the most overpowered removed ability. For the Death Knight specifically, just to give you a real idea of how overpowered some of their spells were, I want to do an honourable mention to a glyph. This was Glyph of Death and Decay, which made it so targets inside Death and Decay had a 20% chance to cower in fear for 2 seconds. So in PvP or PvE, you'd pop your Death and Decay down and it could chain proc this fear effect on anyone inside of it, effectively making them be able to not play the game for as long as it kept proccing. This rather unsurprisingly was changed very early into Wrath, so the glyph just made Death and Decay do more damage instead. But the pick for the Death Knight is a talent that only made it one major patch before it had to be removed from the game because it was so unreasonably overpowered, and that was Shadow of Death. This was a talent found in the Unholy Tree, which in addition to giving you some bonus stats, made it so when you died, you would resurrect as a ghoul and be able to continue fighting for 45 seconds. And of course this worked in PvE, and it also worked in the arena. The ghoul you resurrected as would have their own action bar, with abilities similar to the ghoul pet, and would actually do decent damage. Of course in arena this felt incredibly unfair. Imagine you've managed to finally kill a DK on their release state where they were just crazy OP, only for them to say actually nah, I'm just gonna res myself and continue fighting for a while longer. I guess this talent was supposed to be balanced around the ghoul being weaker than the regular player, as well as it having a limited duration. But at the end of the day, this talent on top of how stacked the DK's toolkit already was, ended up being way too much. Blizzard did try and nerf the duration of the ghoul from 45 seconds down to 25 in patch 3.08, before finally outright removing this talent from working this way in patch 3.1. If you played release Death Knight, there are so many reasons to remember them for, and out of everything they had back then, I think Shadow of Death was for sure one of their strongest abilities. Last but not least, we have the Warrior, and I think there's plenty of things which would be worthy of choosing here, such as how they are in vanilla being the best DPS and tank by some margin, from their scaling to the rage resource and everything else that goes into the class. But I've decided what I want to pick is something a little bit different, something which existed for one expansion. This was a Legion artifact trait that Fury Warriors had called Juggernaut. At its most powerful version, the Juggernaut trait made it so Execute would increase the damage of Execute by 5% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 99 times. Now actually reaching the cap of 99 wasn't realistically going to be possible unless you set up a fight specifically so you could achieve that. But even hitting stacks which went 30 plus, which was definitely doable, meant that your Execute had a 150% 10% damage buff, and this was already a super hard-hitting ability. Of course, warriors have always been known for their strong execute phase, but this artifact trait put Fury warriors on a whole other level. On longer fights where you could have consistent uptime, you'd see Fury rise on the meters, often ending towards the top after they hit really high execute stacks. This was also probably a bit of a design issue for Blizzard moving forwards, as if a boss, for example, did have a long execute phase, this trait will probably make warriors disproportionately good on that specific fight. Either way, when BFA released, the great artifact pruning happened, and every class lost tons of the fun stuff they had had throughout Legion, and Juggernaut was one of those abilities to go. MMOs and grinding have always been synonymous. Often you would have completed a single player game before you even reach level cap in an MMO, or have started on any proper endgame content. This genre of game above all others is known for people who put in crazy hours to achieve things that the average player would never dream of. The grind and long-term progression of living and breathing MMO worlds is something that always keeps fans of the genre coming back, and alongside major updates, it gives these games such timelessness. World of Warcraft, though, comparatively, has often been a bit more on the tame side of things when it comes to the grind, believe it or not. When it first released, it was seen as a more casual-friendly option on the MMO market, since it didn't have XP penalties for having your character die, and the journey from 1 to 60 in vanilla has always seemed long, but as time has progressed, it's become more and more efficient and trimmed down. However, that doesn't mean World of Warcraft, in its own way, hasn't come up with some of the largest grinds you'll find in an MMO, and this definitely isn't specific to Classic either. Though earlier versions of WoW were often seen as the slower paced ones, optional content and achievements have opened up a ton of space to create long-term goals that people can work towards. So today I wanted to go over what have to be 10 of the longest grinds Blizzard have ever put in World of Warcraft during the game's history. These can be from any expansion of World of Warcraft, and I'll go over what was involved in completing each of these actions and just why they took so long. So with that said, let's make a start. I think we have to begin with a grind which has been found in a bunch of different expansions now, and that is the amount of time it can take to camp a rare world spawn. And these are often ones that drop a mount. The most famous example of this has to be the infamous rare spawn, the Time Lost Proto Drake. You know, if you're ever after something rare or that's complicated to get, you go on Wowhead to find some more information, and you see the thing you're after has over 1,500 comments, you're going to be in for a serious challenge. The legendary Time Lost Proto Drake is of course a rare spawn dragon that appears over the storm peaks of Northrend. I mean, its name includes Time Lost, so you should know this is going to take you a while. It is speculated to be somewhere on between an 8 to 24 hour respawn timer, with a bunch of possible respawn points across the entire zone. To complicate things further, another rare spawn dragon, Viragosa, also shares the same spawn timer with the TLPD, so you can sit there flying around spamming your macro hoping to see it, only to land on Viragosa instead, maybe even multiple times in a row. At least it gives you some idea on the next spawn timer, but after so much camping, it's not exactly what you want to see. This mount was the first of its kind of being a mega rare spawn out in the open world, and of course this one was introduced during Wrath of the Lich King when World of Warcraft had a ton of subscribers, which is why it holds such a place of prestige in so many people's minds, especially those who put in the time to go and farm it. It really is difficult though to put a number on how long this grind could take you, because you could just find the mount by accident when you're flying up to Ulduar, or you could be out there camping storm peaks for days on end before you see one. But at least once you do get the tag, the mount will always drop. Either way, I think rare spawn mounts, and especially the Time Lost Proto Drake, have to have a place here. Next is an addition from Vanilla, the Alliance exclusive Winter Saber Trainers. This faction was really just some guy chilling on top of a rock in the middle of nowhere who would teach the players how to ride their very own Winter Spring Frost Saber. However, unlike the Time Lost Proto Drake, this grind wasn't random on how long it would take you. In fact, you could make a pretty good estimate in the total time invested, but you probably didn't want to do that because you'd start realizing how long you would be be working on this for. You started out with 0 reputation and being neutral of course, and your first quest was simply to collect some meat for the tigers. Each time you did this and turned in, it was a plus 50 reputation for you, and this quest would easily take some 10 minutes or so. These quests were of course repeatable, so you could just do them as many times as you wanted to. At 1500 rep, a new quest opened up where you had to defeat 10 furbolgs in Winterfall Village, a bit to the southeast. This place was always busy because of people farming echoes, firewater, and questing, so you could always find people to group up with, and people on the Frost Saber grind would quickly see familiar faces and just throw them invites automatically. This was faster than gathering the meat, though it could be annoying at peak times because again, this place was just always crowded. There was a third quest that you got to for this faction, which was at Honored, that had you go all the way to the south to kill some elite giants, but between getting there and riding back again, it was legitimately 15 minutes if not more, so ultimately this was never worth doing over just farming the furbolgs in Winterfall Village. This meant that really you just did the Winterfall intrusion quest until Exalted, so from 1500 neutral to Exalted, you needed a further 40,500 reputation, which means you needed to do this repeatable quest 810 times. If we call it about 10 minutes or so on average per quest, that maths out to about a 135-hour grind once you are on this part of the quest. You could probably do it faster than that though, especially if you're human with their 10% bonus rep. Blizzard ended up changing this whole system completely in Cataclysm and made it into a bunch of dailies where you just did some tasks each day and then you got your mount after a few weeks instead of needing to do a repeatable quest 810 times, but having a Winter Spring Mountain Classic meant you had undergone a serious grind. Next is a pretty iconic title in the WoW universe, and one that's always been a mega big grind to get, and that is the Insane in the Membrane achievement for the Insane title. This is simply raising a number of obscure reputations to Exalted, which you wouldn't normally do because, I mean, there's no point doing it whatsoever. They were just kind of there to raise the bar to green. This achievement was added towards the start of Wrath of the Lich King in patch 3.1, and earning the Insane title in Wrath was harder than any subsequent expansion because it included an extra reputation which was removed in Cataclysm, Chandra. So originally the reputation requirements for the Insane were honoured with the Bloodsail Buccaneers, and then exalted with Booty Bay, Everlook, Gadgets and Ratchet, Ravenholt, Darkmoon Fair and Chandra. The tricky ones to do were the Bloodsail Buccaneers, Ravenholt and Chandra. Bloodsail Buccaneers would reduce reputation with the other goblin factions, and you had to farm tons of guards inside of Booty Bay to raise your rep from a negative standing up to honoured. Ravenholt was an infamous grind too. For them you had to pickpocket heavy junk boxes from level 55 plus NPCs in the world, and then hand them in 5 at a time for 75 reputation. There were a bunch of spots known for farming this, such as LBRS, or the Murlocs on the northern shore of the Isle of Quel'Danas. Chandra just really involves stockpiling a ton of mats, and the best reputation was a repeatable turn-in for quests for what used to be head enchants in vanilla. One example was the Librum of Focus that could be found in Dire Maul or bought on the auction house. You also needed a pristine black diamond, which was a rare world drop. Again, you just buy it, they're usually cheap, large brilliant shards from disenchanting, and 2 Skin of Shadow. Now the Skin of Shadow, and indeed one of the ingredients for each of these turn-ins, was non-tradable. In this instance they were from Scholarmance, but this was in Wrath, so you could probably farm some 6 or so Skin of Shadow per reset in no time at all, and you needed 84 turn-ins total to go from 0 to Exalted. Librums were also unique, so you had to send them to an alt, then mail them to the character that will be turning them all in one at a time, which was a bit annoying. There were portable mailboxes in Wrath of the Lich King from engineering though, so this wasn't nearly as bad as it sounds. It just took a bunch of time to gather all the materials. Back in early vanilla, you got 200 rep per turn-in, not the 500 you got in Wrath from doing this quest, and you would have had to have run back to a mailbox in between each turn-in, which would have added about 10 minutes or so to the mailbox and back again. Either way, the Insane, still a very long grind to this day, and one that will keep you busy for a while. Next, we're heading forwards many expansions to Warlords of Draenor for the achievement, Warlord of Draenor. I mean, it's an achievement based off the expansion's name. You know this one's going to be pretty difficult. This achievement was earned through PvP, and a lot of it. To start start, you had to build the Gladiator's Sanctum in your garrison and upgrade it to level 3, at which point you'd get a quest to go kill a member of the opposite faction of a certain race. You do that, go turn it in, and the quest giver says, alright, nice, thanks for that, now go kill 500 more players of the same race. And you had to do this once for every single race of the opposite faction. So all in all, you had to defeat all 7 races 500 times total. That's 3,500 kills, which doesn't sound too bad, but the annoying part is that it has to be versus certain races. If you're doing 500 Blood Elves or humans, that's easy, but 500 Pandaren on either faction, yeah, that's going to be a bit more of a problem. People would set up boost runs for this achievement, as kills during a party would count for each player in their party, as in 1 kill could be 5 instead, which would massively speed up this step of the achievement. But after you had this step done, there was more to do as well in the Fight Kill Salute achievement. This needed you to defeat a further 100 players in the Highmoor Coliseum, or be the winner of a combat. After Warlords of Draenor, finding people for this step to actually begin is the hard part, but even during the expansion this would take some time. Again, people can boost this by queuing in with a minimum number of players and then having everyone but 1 player log out so that person auto wins, and then you just rotate until everyone's completed their quests. There were definitely some more creative or cheesy ways to do this achievement to make it way easier than it should have been, but if farming this the normal way via probably just sending Ashran and hoping for the best, this would have taken a seriously long time to complete. Either way, it's a cool title and not an easy one to end up getting however you do it. Now we have another title that was first introduced at the start of Wrath of the Lich King. This is for the achievement The Accomplished Angler, which awards the Salty title. Fishing's always one of those slower and more laid-back skills in games, and in World of Warcraft it's no different. To get this title, you basically had to complete every major fishing achievement that existed up until this point in time. The reason it could take so long is simply because so many of the achievements were just fish in a pool until you get lucky and catch the thing you're after. Some of the harder ones to find could be Mr. Pinchy from the pools in Terakar Forest, winning the Stranglethorn Vale fishing event, and finding all the coins in the pool in Dalaran. I guess it was very fitting that the big fishing achievement needed a ton of patience, but entirely depending on your luck, this one again could be relatively fast or take you a lot of farming over several weeks on and off. Next up, we can't have a list of the biggest grinds in this game without including rank 14 in vanilla World of Warcraft. By now, a good amount of people have attempted ranking themselves and seen what it involves, so I think the appreciation of what goes into this grind will be more than what it used to be. Most importantly though is that we take into account how the grind used to be, not how it is today, because on Anniversary Realms, rank 14 is significantly easier than it typically is, even if it is still a long grind. So let me give you a real brief rundown of the ranking system. To progress PvP ranks in vanilla, you have to earn honor. At the end of each week, your honor earned is calculated versus all other participants in the PvP pool for your faction on your realm. You're then awarded ranking points based upon how high of a percentage you were for honor earned in the last week. These ranking points progress your rank. However, you decay 20% of your ranking points each week, so as you progress it gets much more difficult to keep ranking up, and you can't stop or you'll basically lose all your progression. And since ranking points earned are based off how high you are as a percentage of the total PvP player base, as you approach the higher ranks you must be among the top honor earners for that week, or your decay will be higher than your potential ranking points. At one point to hit rank 14 you had to be within the top 0.1% of players on your realm for 2 weeks in a row. Did you know in Classic we actually played the easier version of ranking where this was extended to the top 0.2% of players instead. This is all quite a lot of words because this system is incredibly convoluted and is completely insane that they went through with this at all. But this will be easily 3 months or so of 16-hour days grinding PvP for rank 14 with no possibility of stopping once you've started, otherwise your progression would basically be reset within the space of a few weeks. Out of every grind on this list, the inability to stop and come back to rank 14 arguably makes it one of the toughest to see all the way through, and it's pretty easy to see why Blizzard changed this whole system in TBC as well. Next up, I have a bit of a different one for you, because most of these grinds have a real point to them. They award something that's dev intended within the game. This one, however, is purely because you want to see your reputation bars filled up. So you know the Insane that we talked about earlier required honored with the Bloodsail Buccaneers, as in Blizzard did not expect you to go any further than this. Well, what if I told you that in fact you could go further than honored with the Bloodsail Buccaneers in vanilla? In fact, if you really wanted to, you could go all the way to Exalted, but the way you had to do it was, well, beyond insane. There have been a few players who have documented their journey of doing this. There is an NPC in Badlands called Jazric who gives repeatable reputation with the Bloodsail Buccaneers. He's on a respawn time of about 7 minutes and has to be killed some 4,200 times to gain enough reputation to be able to hit Exalted, meaning according to a player who's undergone this grind, you can spend some 490 hours or just over 20 days played in total waiting for this one guy to respawn. There is no in-game reward for doing this, of course. This is purely because you want to have completed everything possible, and you need a crazy level of dedication to see this grind through. In fact, this grind alone makes the regular Insane achievement look, well, pretty sane actually. We're into top 3 territory now, so these are definitely some of the longest grinds this game has ever had to offer. At number 3 is the Bloodthirsty title. This was added at the start of Cataclysm, and Wowhead shows that about 1% of profiles have earned this. In theory, this is very simple to do. Just get 250,000 honorable kills. It really is that simple, not much more to say. Realistically, this is such an unreasonably long grind that you'll just work towards it passively whilst doing other PvP meta achievements or PvPing in general. Hopefully you're not actively counting each kill, because doing something 250,000 times and keeping track of it sounds like a sure way to go crazy. I had to check my own account to see how far I'd gotten on this one, as I know I did a lot of PvP back in the day and I only made it up to a mere 172,000 kills. Bit of a casual, I guess, but all I did in this game was PvP between Vanilla and Wrath, and I'm not even sure when those kills started counting, to be fair. Either way, that should give you some idea of how much 250,000 kills actually is. It's a long-term goal that you'll get eventually whilst you're doing other things, but it has to be one of the longest grinds in this game. And number 2 is the meta PvP pet battle achievement to earn the title Trainer. This is earned from winning 1,000 pet battles with a full team of level 25 pets. I had to go and check myself personally because I know I did a bunch of pet battles in MOP and I got just under the 300 mark by the looks of it. I remember doing this and I got bored of going versus the same meta comps all the time. Keep in mind, this wasn't just playing 1,000 PvP pet battles, it's winning them, which makes it significantly harder. In fact, on Wowhead, with rounding, this achievement is shown as being earned by 0% of profiles, meaning under 0.5% of the player base have earned this title, and it was added into the game over a decade ago. Now of course, PvP pet battles is a bit of a niche within a niche, meaning not that many people are going to be going for it in the first place, but nevertheless, 1,000 PvP pet battle wins is going to take you an extreme amount of time. Of course though, as is often the case with PvP and matchmaking, some people do look to spam Q at off-peak times to try and win trade, but even still, this title is still super rare to see to this day in World of Warcraft. As such, Trainer is easily one of the toughest grinds you can do, which means at number 1 we have another PvP related achievement for the Khan title. This is a meta achievement that was added for having completed all achievements for all the battlegrounds added between Wrath of the Lich King and Mists of Pandaria. Similar to Trainer, this one was added in during Mists of Pandaria, and similar to Trainer, this has also been obtained by a 0% of profiles rounded down according to Wowhead, which puts it up there as one of the rarest titles and hardest grinds in the game. This one will simply involve playing a crazy amount of each battleground, chasing each of the achievements that needed to be done. Not only does each battleground have its own set of achievements which can be difficult in their own right, but you need to have won each one 100 times as well. This one will be a grind that will, without exaggeration, take you months, if not well over a year of working towards, as you gradually chip away at each of the requirements for this meta achievement. PvP achievements are always tricky due to the competitive nature of battlegrounds and arena, so it makes sense that we're seeing some of the longest grinds in the game tied to this area of content. Spanning over 2 decades worth of content, the World of Warcraft has seen an incredible amount of updates come and go. From class changes, new systems, zones and more, the world of an MMORPG has to constantly grow and evolve for it to keep going. However, sometimes what the developers want to add in just doesn't quite work out in the grand scheme of things. Occasionally projects are just too big to be completed, at times they don't feel quite right for the expansion, and sometimes an idea would resurface many years later to finally be realized. The biggest cancelled projects over World of Warcraft's history are what I want to talk about today. Which expansions they took place in, how far along the development pipeline they were, why were they cancelled if we have some idea, and did these projects ever make a return in a future expansion. Also, I've tried to keep things varied across a bunch of expansions too, because believe me, this whole video quite easily could have been the top 10 things cancelled in Warlords of Draenor, and I didn't want it to be all about WoD as much as it could have been. So with that said, let's make a start and check out 10 of the largest cancelled World of Warcraft projects of all time. First is something that's set to be an upcoming feature in World of Warcraft Midnight, player housing. But player housing has been something that Blizzard have been toying with the idea of implementing as far back as before vanilla even released. At the time, it wasn't uncommon for MMOs to have some form of housing or guild gathering halls where you could spend your downtime, so it seemed as though it would be a natural addition to Blizzard's MMO. The scope of vanilla, however, was truly massive. They had content in the pipeline such as the Black Temple and even Northrend as early as vanilla. Back then it was a question of how do they deliver on all of these cool things in a way that makes sense and is achievable on a reasonable timescale. However, adding in housing was no small feat, and it appears to be one of those features that technically or otherwise just kept not quite having enough importance to see through. We have some blue posts from as early as 2004 talking about the potential of housing. Player housing will not be available until World of Warcraft has been released. Our plan is to add player housing in a future live update or expansion. Our current idea, which could change, is to extend the cities to have player housing neighborhoods. For example, in the canal area of Stormwind, players can see a blue instance portal behind a large portcullis. This is the entrance to the player housing neighborhood in Stormwind. And indeed, that mysterious portcullis is still there to this day in vanilla, teasing for content that perhaps could have been, or maybe one day still will be. There were interestingly there also talks of guild halls at this early stage too. You'd have to imagine these would be large communal areas where members of your guild would spend time, chat, share achievements and so on. However, the release date on housing just kept slipping by as players continually asked for updates, with Tom Chilton saying in late TBC that, no, we're not working on it right now, it's incredibly complex to do right, and we're not sure yet if it's going to be the right thing for World of Warcraft in the long run. Of course then, many years later, Warlords of Draenor happened and introduced garrisons, which many players took to be WoW's attempt at housing, but there was a lack of customization, segregation from the larger player base, and a lack of content outside of this, which made it seem as though garrisons ensured that housing would be forever buried in World of Warcraft. That was until recently, of course, when Midnight confirmed housing, and we've already seen plenty of playtests and teasers which point to the kind of system that maybe Blizzard and the players envisioned all those years ago. Housing has been on the to-do list for Blizzard for over 20 years, and hopefully when it's finally available, it's better late than never. Another thing that was at one point planned during the vanilla stage of the game was the Dragon Isles. Again, Dragon Isles would be the setting for a more recent expansion in Dragonflight, but similar to housing, this had been something that was set in motion years before it was finally released within the game. Originally, the Dragon Isles were set to be at the far northern point of the Eastern Kingdoms, and we have some super early concept work of the World of Warcraft map which shows Dragon Isles around this point. We have another one later on as well that was a bit more fleshed out, and this one had the Dragon Isles to be a level 65 to 70 plus raid. So it appeared as though the Dragon Isles was planned to be both a zone in the outer world and to have PvE content as well. There are also a few limited excerpts of the Dragon Isles from Designer Island, where we can see large stony structures, Naga architecture, and a huge seashell looking piece of artwork, which is kind of reminiscent of the outside of Shrine of the Storm from Battle for Azeroth. During vanilla though, the Dragon Isles was little more than a name and an idea, and it definitely wasn't as worked on as some of the future projects that we'll talk about. Nevertheless, there wouldn't be any future work on this content or anything supporting its name until the the Dragonflight expansion came along and delivered what was ultimately a much more expansive experience of what the Dragon Isles could be. Next, I want to talk about something which at this point has to be one of World of Warcraft's longest running jokes, the Dance Studio. You probably heard of it being a suspected bit of content in Warlords of Draenor, but its roots actually run all the way back to Wrath of the Lich King, and it appears as though the whole idea of the Dance Studio, or new dances, actually got quite far into development. In fact, the Wrath of the Lich King reveal trailer from 2007 has new dances as a feature. And we also have a blue post from late on in TBC where Bornak says, "We are also providing players the opportunity to learn new or different dances with the Dance Studio." However, creating custom dances and animating them for every race so they felt natural within the game turned out to be much more work than Blizzard anticipated, and as such it was constantly pushed down the priority list as major content patches with new raids and features ate up all of the development time. The last we really heard was in BlizzCon of 2015, where Tom Chilton stated that Blizzard would still like to add the Dance Studio someday, but it was a matter of finding the animation time for it. The Dance Studio has since featured in a ton of different April Fool's patch notes, and during Warlords of Draenor, the Dance Studio was at one point shown as being both a garrison building and having its own mission to unlock it. However, this was all just for a bit of fun and it didn't go anywhere. Next, you'll have a system that was planned for Cataclysm, but it was cancelled, and it was named Path of the Titans. Similar to Dance Studio, this feature also appears to have gotten quite far into development, as it appeared as a major expansion feature on a cinematic for Cataclysm. This system would have been related to the also new archaeology secondary profession, as well as the cultish or old gods theme of Cataclysm. Players would dedicate themselves to one titan, which were between Agramar, Aman'Thul, Ionar, Khazgarath, Golganath or Norgannon. After having done that through completing various in-game activities such as dailies, raiding, PvP and so on, they would progress their chosen titan and eventually unlock ancient glyphs, which could be equipped and upgraded to gain various bonuses. It seems as though each titan had choices to be made for defense, utility or damage as well. These ancient glyphs would also rank up as the expansion progressed to increase their power over time. Though the foundation of the Path of the Titan sounds interesting with picking a titan, the actual gameplay was just passive and the rewards just weren't terribly interesting as they were stat increases. Ultimately, it was decided that this system wasn't different enough from glyphs, so instead Blizzard just added in prime glyphs for Cataclysm and called it a day and cancelled the Path of the Titans. You do wonder if there was any inspiration from this system for Covenants in Shadowlands, with the whole idea of locking into a specific choice and sticking with it. Though as we now know, forcing players down one path and having no flexibility is not something that's well received. Next up, I have the first edition from Warlords of Draenor. I got this far without mentioning something from that expansion. That's pretty good going, but I picked out what are a few of the larger pieces of cancelled content that expansion saw. First, for Warlords of Draenor, I want to talk about Farallon. This zone should have represented Netherstorm in its pre-Outland state. In fact, if you played TBC recently, you may remember there are giants up in Netherstorm called Farallon Breakers, so the name of this zone had been a thing all the way back since original TBC. In the early stages of Warlords of Draenor, Farallon was planned to be a zone that the expansion would provide, and there is early work of the map of Draenor showing as much. However, as for exactly how Farallon would fit into the expansion was the problem. Ian Hazacostas claimed that it was originally intended to be a separate zone where boosted players would start before launch, before later much of its development was rolled into Tanaan Jungle, which was already shaping up to be a much more fleshed out experience. Later during the PTR for 6.2, Khadgar offered a quest to go to Farallon, where he said, "Have you ever heard of Farallon? Archmage Vargoth won't stop talking about it. Beautiful fields and forests dotted with natural crystalline formations that make it the magical nexus of Draenor. It's nearly impossible to get to. The magical storms in the seas around it are frequent and unpredictable. For your ring, I'm assuming this would have been the legendary ring, we'll need a magical artifact from Farallon. You'll need an absolutely top-notch Overwatch crew to sail safely to the region and get back alive, so choose carefully and get me that artifact. This appeared to have you send out a naval mission from the shipyard, which was new to 6.2, over to Farallon in order to retrieve an item, which I assume would allow the player to then themselves visit the zone. However, this quest didn't make it into the game, and as time went on, Farallon just no longer made sense to invest time into and to finish. Ultimately, it just missed the window where it could have been relevant content. Next, we are sticking in Warlords of Draenor for another large cancelled project, the Shatraf Raid. Similar to Farallon, this was a piece of content that at one point was planned for Warlords of Draenor, and again it appeared on early versions of the map that was shown at BlizzCon 2013. There was actually a Battle for Shatraf quest that took place in Talador, where you could play through a series of quests that would progress the story of the expansion. This could have been a replacement for this being instance content instead. It appears as though the Shatraf Raid should have been an early tier within Warlords of Draenor, as during the Battle for Shatraf quest series, the Iron Horde forces are being led by Blackhand, who is defeated, however he manages to escape. Of course, we beat him once and for all in the Blackrock Foundry Raid, which was the expansion's second tier, so because of this, the Shatraf Raid had to have come before it to fit within the narrative. Unless they just completely changed this questline because they decided not to do the Shatraf Raid, that is. As for the potential of the raid itself, we don't really have too much information. You have to imagine it would have been laid out to some extent in a similar way to how it ended up being in TBC, or at least to have referenced events which could have led to that layout. So it may have had an upper and lower city, as well as the large central area in the middle. Ultimately though, Blizzard just didn't have the time to fully see this idea through, and it remains one of the many scrapped pieces of content from WoD. The final major piece of scrap content from Warlords of Draenor I want to talk about is the cancellation of Karabor Temple, which is what later became the Black Temple in TBC and beyond. This was supposed to be the Alliance capital for the expansion, and to add insult to injury here, we ended up with what felt like a small camp in Stormshield at the side of Ashran instead. The Horde didn't fare much better, by the way. They were supposed to have Bladespire Citadel over in Frostfire Ridge, but the Temple of Karabor simply has so much more history to it. Many players had already experienced the Black Temple, either back in original TBC or on transmog runs in the future, but to get to see it during its prime during Draenor was just a huge opportunity to have missed. On top of that, there was actually already a lot of work that had gone into sculpting out the interior of Karabor. It should have been a majestic Draenei city with crystal spires, huge water features, and tons of open spaces to explore, and it would have been overlooking the entire zone of Shadowmoon Valley. In fact, I even found that there was a defense of Karabor scenario in early versions of Warlords of Draenor 2. This seems to have been part of a quest series that did make it into the game though. You'd have thought this quest would be a build up to unlocking Karabor for the player, but ultimately we were never able to access this promised capital city, which the expansion really deserved. Now we're getting into the top 3 territory, and here I have another entry from Vanilla, which is arguably the largest piece of cancelled content from this version of the game, the Emerald Dream. The Emerald Dream zone actually still exists in the vanilla game files to this day, and is truly the most massive zone you will have ever seen. It's almost endless green fields, alien plants, strange statues, and tons more. Jeff Kaplan said about the Emerald Dream during its development that the Emerald Dream is shaping up to be extremely cool. We don't want to preview any of the content yet as it is endgame, and we want some surprises for players. The zone is massive and beautiful, and once the content team is done with it, it will be exceedingly challenging. But as we've seen with some other pieces of content, the scope of what Blizzard wanted to achieve with the Emerald Dream just never quite made sense to fit it into the game. And in 2013, Chris Metzen had this to say about it. The Emerald Dream is a nice idea, and the team has talked about making it into an expansion many times. Building an entire expansion's worth of zones around a lush green forest theme would get very boring, so the Emerald Dream will be better used as a raid, dungeon, or a subzone, not an entire expansion. And we now know that it was indeed finally used as an open world zone and a raid in the Dragonflight expansion, which I think did it justice as for how it would be used in a modern WoW setting. Nevertheless, there is the start of potentially a massive zone right there still in the vanilla game files, and whilst I agree it's probably better as a zone than an expansion, perhaps it's something we will see more of in vanilla one day. At the number 2 spot we have another cancelled feature of Cataclysm, the Abyssal Maw raid or dungeon. I say raid or dungeon because honestly Honestly, when I was first looking into this, it was a bit unclear what exactly the Abyssal Maw was supposed to be. Players refer to it as a raid because it makes sense within the whole scope of the elemental planes theme that Cataclysm had going on. We had Throne of the Four Winds for air, Firelands for fire. For earth, I mean Nefarian's the son of Deathwing, who is the Earth Warder. That's a bit of a stretch, but okay, I'm just gonna pick that for earth. And the Abyssal Maw would have been for water. On top of that, the Throne of the Tides dungeon is right there too as the water-themed dungeon, so we've already got that done and ticked off. In fact, the entrance for the Abyssal Maw is still literally right there in the game next to the Throne of the Tides as well. And if we step back a bit and check out the BlizzCon 2010 Dungeons and Raids panel, they have it advertised as a 4-boss dungeon at this early stage, and they even make it clear it's nothing like the Oculus because they must have known that type of content where you're moving along a vertical axis wasn't that great. But then after Cataclysm had finished, Ghostcrawler talked a bit more in detail about this cancelled content. He says, "I feel like I should talk about the Abyssal Maw again. It was 3 bosses inside Nespira with no unique ARP. So Nespira was one of those massive ancient beings that you see in Vashj'ir that kind of look like giant shellfish and you swim inside them for certain quests. The reason it was originally appealing to us is because we had so many Vashj'ir assets that we could use, but by the time it was time to do the work, we felt like we, and many players, had Vashj'ir fatigue. Don't get me wrong, I love Vashj'ir, and it delivered on the promise of an underwater zone, but we feel like most players were ready to be done with it by the time they had quested through that. Firelands received a lot of new arts from bosses to environments, and we just didn't feel like the Abyssal Maw was going to compete. Who knows though, we haven't totally given up on the idea of cool underwater experiences, so there's potential we'd visit it again someday. So what I can tell from this is that the Abyssal Maw was going to be a raid that would release alongside the Firelands raid in 4.1, kind of similar to how 4.0 had 3 raids total. This would explain why the Firelands was a relatively short raid boss-wise. Your raid for the week should have been Firelands and the Abyssal Maw, not just Firelands. But ultimately Blizzard weren't overly convinced about the whole underwater thing, and they decided to just put their time and efforts into the Firelands instead, leaving this cancelled raid as a bit of a mystery. But Ghostcrawler interestingly also references the thing I want to talk about for the #1 spot too during this interview, where he says, "For my money, the zone that I'm personally saddest about cancelling is not the Abyssal Maw, it was the Azjol-Nerub quest zone in Wrath of the Lich King." So basically what Azj-Kahet is in The War Within should have already existed as a zone as early as Wrath of the Lich King. The Nerubian Empire is said to be massive, spanning endless underground caverns and tunnels, and that is what this cancelled zone should have been. We do have a really nice gallery of artwork planned for this zone, and I can see that many of the pieces found here found their way into the game during Wrath's duration. You can definitely see inspiration for how buildings are held up via webs or suspended in the sky in Azj-Kahet today from this artwork, so it seems as though it was still used as a reference point all these years later, which is really cool if that's the case. There had also been a good amount of work planned on this open area of what would have been World of Warcraft's first subterranean zone, including many buildings and huge caverns. In fact, Zelnef, aka Alexander Brazzi, even mentioned during a Reddit post the following: "I'm really sad that Azjol-Nerub got downgraded into an instance, but the plans for it, including wall climbing mounts, were dramatically outside of the scope of what the team could create in Lich King." Zelnef ultimately concludes that it wasn't implemented simply because they didn't have time to deliver on the scope of the project before launch. As we know it though, Azjol-Nerub ended up being changed into 2 dungeons, one with its own name, and the second one being Ahn'kahet, the Old Kingdom. I guess what Azjol-Nerub could have been in Wrath of the Lich King finally now does exist in Azj-Kahet, but back then it would have been an amazing addition were they able to pull it off. The capital cities or main hubs in World of Warcraft are places where we've all spent a lot of time, whether that's in between raiding or dungeons, waiting to PvP, or just figuring out what you'll be doing next. Over the years, each of these capitals has had a different feel to them as well, from their aesthetics, how user-friendly they are to get around and find what you need, and of course your preference as well. And I wanted to rate them from what I feel are the worst to the best capitals in the game. There are around 20 total over over all the expansions, if we're including reworks that is, and some of them have been used more than once as well. But for this I want to just cover each hub once in what is, in my opinion, its best version, instead of talking about them more than once if they've been used on several occasions. So with that said, I'm going to rank all the main hubs in World of Warcraft, starting with the worst and ending off with the best. And if we're starting with the worst, well, say it with me everyone, it is obviously Oribos. You do wonder at times just how did so many things simultaneously go wrong with Shadowlands that even the main hub for the expansion is also among the worst, or in my opinion, the worst one Blizzard has ever made. A confusing series of circular rooms which all look pretty much identical from the center, leaving you with questions such as, which floor is the Flight Master on? What floor am I supposed to be on for this quest? Why isn't the Maw teleporter working on this floor? And biggest of all, why am I still playing this game? And if like me, maybe you didn't play a ton of Shadowlands, each time you come back here and forget which was your character you progress the story on to some extent, you have to try and rework out how to navigate this area and progress the story enough to access the other zones in Shadowlands, unless they've changed that by now. Surely this is changed by now, right? Oh, and that's before we get to the downstairs bit, or the outer ring of Oribos too, which adds more layers of confusion, NPCs and random quest stuff which is just hidden all over the place. It's grey, it's confusing to navigate, and you need quest progress to make this place functional. And out of every single main hub in World of Warcraft, if there was any I actively dislike, it's this one. This is by far the worst capital in the game that's ever been produced, and it is not close. The next worst is in Warlords of Draenor. Now WoD wasn't as bad as Oribos, it was just disappointing, and that is very in theme for Warlords of Draenor, to be fair. You know, the intended main hub at one point in time for the Horde was supposed to be a massive outpost in Frostfire Ridge, and for the Alliance the Temple of Karabor in Shadowmoon Valley, which is of course what it was called pre-Black Temple. Suffice to say, either of these options would have been a massive improvement over Ashran, which was just kind of forgettable. It never had the size or feeling of being a central hub or a capital. It was just a somewhat convenient collection of NPCs on a small island, which was detached from everything else the expansion had to offer. And to be honest, the two faction hubs on Ashran, which were Warspear for Horde and Stormshield for Alliance, are basically just waiting rooms for the Ashran PvP zone, which was to be the main focus of the island itself. Ashran just never felt as though it was a place for players who were meant to spend a lot of time. You very much get the feeling that Blizzard were out of time on producing the expansion, and they just had to use something which had been finished, so they picked this. Unless of course in Warlords of Draenor you were to consider your garrison to be your hub, of course, which I'm not entirely sure there are more redeeming things to say about it, because you're there solo all the time. Doesn't feel like much of a mainstay either. Overall though, Ashran is just kind of boring, forgettable, and feels like a placeholder. Definitely one of the worst main hubs in WoW. Next is going to be what I suspect will be unpopular pick number one from me here, and that's the Undercity. I don't like the Undercity at all. I don't like the music, don't like the atmosphere, and I don't like the layout of it. Now, I know the theme that it's going for is fitting. It's supposed to be a destroyed city now occupied by the undead. I mean, thematically, it's doing what it's supposed to do, but when I'm leveling something on the Horde and I end up there, I want it to be a short stay, because it's just not very appealing to me. And I don't know about you, but whenever I'm looking for something in the Undercity, I end up going the wrong way. As in, do you need to go to those underground bits where the apothecaries are for a quest? Do you need to go to where Sylvanas is? And biggest of all, which set of stairs is closest to the Flight Master in the center? Never mind, I'll do what I always do and just run around the whole ring till I see the guy with a bat next to him. I know it's a classic capital and a lot of people love their undead and fair play, but for me, it's just not a place I enjoy being. Next up, I'm bundling the two new faction capitals from TBC together, both Silvermoon City and the Exodar. I'm sorry, but what was the point of these? The most use either one saw is during random events in future expansions. Even during actual TBC playing the new races, you barely spent any time in your faction's capitals. And if you wanted to go back to either of them, you really had to go out of your way as well, either through the Undercity teleporter or getting a boat from Astronar. For what it's worth, again, thematically, both cities are great for their particular race. Silvermoon is a majestic city of the elves, and Exodar is basically a spaceship that smashed carved into the floor, and the Draenei just said, that sounds good enough, we'll build our city here. But as they have always been, there is just really no reason to be in either Silvermoon or the Exodar. They must be among the most underappreciated pieces of work put into this game, and unfortunately, because of that, I really just can't rate them that highly. Following that, I have the current hub for the war within, Dornegal. I don't know what it is about Dornegal, but it just feels kind of forgettable and a bit bland, which is weird to say when it's the current expansion capital. I don't think the Earthen Dwarves are particularly the most interesting of races out there either, and their city being a lot of big grey blocks, whilst again fitting, isn't very exciting to be part of. It feels almost like Ashran in a way, where it's a bunch of conveniently placed NPCs in a random open world environment, and it all looks quite samey when you're flying above it at light speed on your dragon, and it's pretty easy to get confused as to where you need to go. For me, I always get lost trying to find that teleporter for Ashkahet, for example. Overall, I'm just not a huge fan of Dornegal, especially when you see how amazing some other zones look in the same expansion. Following that, we have the main hubs from Mists of Pandaria, which are Shrine of the Two Moons for Horde and Shrine of the Seven Stars for Alliance. I'm just going to put them together here because they're basically the same thing in terms of how they're laid out. You've got an outside area with vendors, and then an inside area with the two paths leading up into rooms with teleporters, and the other one more vendors, tier set sellers and all that. The big downside here is that you still require engineering to use the auction house here, same as how Dalaran was in Wrath of the Lich King. I mean, as far as I know, you're still always taking engineering anyway because it's just the most overpowered profession ever, but having that level of convenience tied to a profession really doesn't feel that great. The shrines are just okay, and I've never had the feeling of them being much of a central hub, to be honest. They're very small areas, and there's not a ton to see here. It feels more like a pit stop before you're wanting to head out back into the open world again, which is fine, but equally doesn't make them too memorable either. Don't really have strong feelings towards either of the shrines, they're just very average for me. Next, we're heading into Battle for Azeroth for the Horde capital there, Dazar'alor. This is home of the Zandalari trolls, and I don't think there has ever been a more expansive capital city than this one. You could have spent the entire expansion playing Horde regularly and still be finding out new things here, such as secrets, vendors, NPC interactions, and so on. In that regard, it was really cool. However, Dazar'alor was too big. I mean, I can get lost working out where the Flight Master is in Undercity. Do you think I can actually find anything in this place without having Google open? Nah, this place was just way too hard to find what you needed to find half of the time, and because of that, it became kind of irritating for me. Dazar'alor looks amazing, there's always something new to find here, but oftentimes it was just a bit too user-unfriendly as a central hub. Next is, for me, the best modern World of Warcraft hub we've seen through recent expansions, and that is Valdrakken. Everything you need to find is relatively close together towards the center of it, such as your professions, auction house, teleporters, and so on. It could be a bit confusing with quests because Dragonflight just had a habit of filling your quest log up with random stuff, and sometimes you had to go talk with the dragons way up on top of the tower, but there was a teleporter up there, so it wasn't too bad. Valdrakken felt like a city somehow more than a lot of others on this list did. It was always busy at the center of it, and it made the game feel alive, which is very good and important for an MMO. You could also take off from the main tower to pretty much wherever you needed to go in the expansion with the new dragon riding feature. Valdrakken was visually impressive and it fit in well with the Dragonflight expansion, so I thought it was overall a solid capital. Next is Orgrimmar, and specifically the pre-Cataclysm version. The main reason for pre-Cataclysm is actually the music. I swear those horns that go off at the start of the post-Cataclysm Orgrimmar soundtrack are just way too annoying, and they make me want to mute the music in the game. When a piece of music starts with blaring noise, it's just not very appealing for me. Old Orgrimmar is definitely solid though, but not my favourite classic Horde hub. It also has that feeling of being a city from the main gates where you walk into it, and then you have the popular areas outside the auction house, you have the people flexing their mounts and gear on top of the bank and so on. The downside is it's very brown. I mean, it's fitting, but not exactly the most interesting to behold either. The layout can also be a bit annoying at times with having to go as far as humanly possible to get from the auction house to the anvils for certain professions, and some profession trainers are a bit hidden too, with Orgrimmar having several levels to it. You know, back in the day, the main reason that I chose to play Alliance in this game was because I preferred the Alliance capitals over the Horde ones. It wasn't really for anything specifically tied to races or classes. I figured you spend so much time in these capital cities that, well, I wanted to be in one where where I actually enjoyed being all of the time, and you spend by far the most time in Orgrimmar as Horde, so as much as I think it's a solid hub, it's not the best one out there for me. Now we're moving on to TBC with Shattrath. I have a feeling that putting Shattrath over Orgrimmar may be a bit controversial, I guess we'll see on that, but I know I rather like the capital of World of Warcraft's first expansion. It has a great location in relation to the rest of the Burning Crusade. You could really fly out anywhere and be where you needed to be pretty fast. There was always so many people there, so it had that feeling of being a city because there were travel hubs, reputation, and even some quests took place here as well. There were Aldor and Scryers for choices on different characters as well, though there wasn't too much difference between them in reality, though it was an interesting idea at the time. Overall, Shattrath fit TBC really well as a broken world where different factions are coming together out of necessity to fight something bigger than their disputes, and as such it made sense as the first neutral city. You had Lower City with random vendors, the Ethereal, the Arakoa, and the Upper City with Blood Elves and Draenei training for war, and then of course Adal at the centre. It just felt as though it really all came together. Also, who can forget the short city tour with Khadgar's Elemental? There were definitely some downsides such as no class trainers to respec, and I remember oftentimes profession trainers were just over in Outlands somewhere and you had to go find them instead of being in Shattrath, but other than that it was a good place to be. Next is the final Horde capital on the list, and that is Thunderbluff. While Undercity is dark and grim, and Orgrimmar is brown and also grim, Thunderbluff has a totally different feel to it. The more spiritual and nature-attuned Tauren give a side to the Horde that they very much needed. It has a nice central area around the auction house with a nearby bank, the mailbox, the anvils, and even a little fishing pool at the centre. It's all very convenient. It could be a bit confusing to know where to go in Thunderbluff with all the different rope bridges, and you always have the danger of accidentally walking off, but those were the only real downsides. It was a cool idea for a city to be up in the air like this as well, and it just feels completely different from anything else that we saw at the time. You know, for a period of time in Season of Discovery, Thunderbluff was the Horde hub for Classic instead of Orgrimmar, because you could still get world buffs there, and it was just better situated for getting to the BFD raid. And man, would have it felt better playing Horde if I could have justified spending more time here overall. Ultimately, it's a more used capital than the likes of Silvermoon or Exodar, so it gets points for that, but it still goes probably a bit underused for how good it is. Next is really the counterpart of Thunderbluff faction-wise, Darnassus, as in the not on fire Darnassus, that is. Again, I want to make the same comment about Season of Discovery here. Phase 1, this was the place to be. For the first time ever, Darnassus was the Alliance capital, and it was just glorious. I wish it was like this all of the time because I would want to set my Hearthstone here. There was definitely a nostalgia thing for me as well to some extent. My first character was a Night Elf, so when I walked into Darnassus it just blew me away, and all these years later I still love being here just as much. Yes, there are absolutely some annoyances that hold it back. The auction house is a mile from a mailbox, there is no anvil here at all. They did add one in Season of Discovery though, but thematically you won't need an anvil because Teldrassil doesn't even have mining nodes at all. It's a giant tree. You don't get mining as a Night Elf till you talk to some dwarves at Darkshore. Despite this, it still remains one of my absolute favourites, and I just really wish there were more reasons to be here because Darnassus is literally in the middle of nowhere. It's decent for late game in terms of getting to Moonglade or Felwood, Winterspring and so on, but for anything else south of that, you're often just better taking a boat from somewhere on the Eastern Kingdoms, unless you fancy a nice 15 to 20 minute flight path. Next is the Alliance capital from BFA, Boralus. Simply put, this is a brilliant version of a naval city. There are ships passing by, tons of traders, and it's a place that just feels alive. Boralus is actually pretty massive as well, but unlike Dazaralor, Blizzard didn't decide to hide half of the stuff you want to find throughout the city, and instead just put all the useful stuff pretty close together, such as teleports, professions, and so on. The whole lower city part of Boralus is super expansive, and has things such as the Black Market Auction House, Pet Battle Dungeon teleporters and more, but it's all extras that you don't need to find on a daily basis. The music here is also great, and it gives good connections to the rest of the zones for Alliance. BFA had a lot of criticism in retrospect, but for me Boralus was great and deserves a high place on this list. Following that we have Dalaran, and out of the 2 times we've had this place as a main hub, the clear winner for me is the Legion version. There's more going on throughout the city, you don't need engineering for the auction house, and many class order halls were linked to Dalaran. Legion Dalaran took this floating city and put it dead dead center of the expansion. It was super convenient to fly out to anywhere you needed to be, easy access via teleports to the rest of Azeroth if you wanted to go to another expansion for whatever reason, and so many small details such as NPC pathing around the city, random events, secrets to be found, and so on. There was a PvP zone in the sewer, which was, it was a complete mess, but it was a fun kind of mess, and you could always turn it off if you wanted to. Class order halls could be accessed from Dalaran too, well, for a number of classes they could anyway, and these were one of the best thematic features for our classes we have ever seen. They really captured the essence of what it feels like to be your particular class. Dalaran was also pretty compact in size, but still always felt alive because of this. Legion was just a good time to be playing World of Warcraft, and its version of Dalaran was a great capital. At number 2 is Ironforge. Carved into the side of the mountain, the home of the dwarves is everything you expect it to be and more. Giant majestic halls, epic soundtrack, and a huge forge as a central feature to the whole city. The scope of this city is huge as well, but there were always enough people in it to make it feel active, and especially when you first get there without a mount, it can take some time to traverse around. Ironforge and Stormwind also had the deep run tram too as an extra feature, and it is in a great location in the world which was easy to travel to a number of places from. Ironforge did the whole mountain home feeling super well, and without a doubt is one of the best faction capitals in the game, which leaves only one left, and that is of course Stormwind. Old Stormwind, that is, the pre-Cataclysm one. This place is simply a masterpiece. You don't forget the first time you walk into Stormwind through the main gates with the massive statues at the side and the music blasting. Amazing soundtrack here as well, by the way. Inside the city, it just really feels more varied than other main hubs do. There's the trade district with the auction house and mailbox close together, and this place is always busy. There's the mage quarter that links up with the park area of the zone. There's the dwarven district with the smoke rising. You have machines moving about and the focus on professions. There's Stormwind Keep beyond that, and of course Old Town, and it just keeps on going. Stormwind has a ton of random events too. You have school classes moving throughout the streets, NPC interactions in bars, war vets telling their old stories, and so on. And you have small city noises in the background too. This is particularly noticeable in the dwarven district, and these really come into play as the music quietens down eventually. Stormwind links with so many quests in the game too, right from the Defias at the start all the way to uncovering Onyxia's plot at the end. Speaking of Onyxia, world buffs also drop here, so even if you're just AFKing, there's a chance you get a buff and then can continue on questing with that. Stormwind just captures the feeling of a city the best out of any capital WoW has seen. It's very varied, there's no flying, it's grounded fantasy, large scale, it feels alive, and players have so many reasons to be there, and that's why for me Old Stormwind gets the top spot as the best capital in WoW's history. MMORPGs are games that constantly evolve and change. What is normal one expansion may be gone the next, and sometimes new systems prove so successful or end up being so ingrained within the fabric of the game that they fundamentally change it forever. Today I want to talk about the updates to World of Warcraft that have been the most game-changing in its 20+ year duration. I also want to focus on those gameplay-changing updates that have stuck as well, and ones which are still part of the game today, rather than including ones which were, whilst impactful at the time, didn't last more than a few expansions at most. So with that said, let's start and check out what I think are the 10 most impactful gameplay updates World of Warcraft has ever seen. Starting off at 10, I want to talk about what I call the Timeless Isle format of content. This was the earliest example of a zone that Blizzard created towards the end of an expansion that was purely designed to have content there that will last 4 months. The name Timeless was truly fitting, as completing the meta achievement there would take a crazy amount of time. There were the Timeless coins to grind for various rewards, the reputation with Emperor Xiaohao, battle pets, 2 sets of world bosses in the August Celestials and Ordos, collectible toys, hidden areas of the zone that were difficult to get to, and loads of random items like that meteor that launch you across the map. There were also random events happening constantly, such as the Ghost Ship, Hualom, Rare Spawns, and more. Simply simply put, the Timeless Isle was the most repeatable content Blizzard had ever fit into such a small zone, and in the future they very much repeated this format when it came to endgame zones. Warlords of Draenor had Tanaan Jungle, Legion had Suramar and later Argus, BFA had Mechagon and Nazjatar, and so on. In expansions past this, Blizzard have started spreading out collection and completion content much more, instead of just focusing it into endgame zones, even though new content is still always pretty feature dense in this game. Either way, for me, the Timeless Isle was the trendsetter and the first of its kind, and though Blizzard do things a bit differently nowadays, when it comes to collection and completion based content, I still think it is worth talking about. Next is a gameplay update that was technically made in Warlords of Draenor, and that's a change to raiding that stuck to this day: the brand new Mythic mode. And yes, Siege of Orgrimmar was technically the first raid to be given a Mythic difficulty, however this happened in the Warlords of Draenor pre-patch, so it is an update from WoD. Blizzard had really been trying to figure out raiding over World of Warcraft's first several expansions, and they changed it all the time. At the largest raid size, we went from 40 players in vanilla to 25 in TBC, and then in Wrath, something changed about raiding with every single brand new tier. It started with 10 or 25, then we had hard mode in Ulduar, then heroic in Trial of the Grand Crusader, and then heroic and attempts in ICC. Kata changed this to just 10 or 25 heroic and increased the difficulty, and Mr. Pandaria followed with that format. But Blizzard saw 10 and 25 heroic both being offered as problematic. Sometimes there were fights that were easier on 10 player because you have mechanics where you needed to spread out, and when you have less players you have more room to work with. Alternatively, on 25 player fights that needed a lot of raid wide cooldowns or tons of healing, they were often easier on that difficulty because when you have more players you just have more cooldowns to use. Also, people endlessly argued over which mode was in fact harder and the volume of loot that dropped between each difficulty. This probably stems from Wrath of the Lich King, when 10 mode was literally designed to be easier than 25, but Blizzard later changed that in Kata so that they were both on equal footing. So in Warlords of Draenor they came up with the answer: the brand new Mythic mode. This was 20 player only and essentially replaced heroic as the new hardest raid difficulty. This would allow Blizzard to tune the fights perfectly for 20 players and to know how much loot should be given, which you have to imagine made their job as designers much easier and allowed players to pick which type of raiding they wanted to do, from the super easy LFR all the way to Mythic. Mythic is still the format that's used all these years later too, and things have only gotten more and more difficult at the top end. At the start of BFA, the Race to World First Guild method infamously streamed their Mythic progression for the first time ever, allowing viewers to follow along and see what it takes to be in one of the best guilds in the world in real time, and this event was hugely successful, leading to the Race to World First still being a highly anticipated event with each new raid tier, all thanks to Mythic mode. And whilst I think Mythic launches in a state where it's honestly way too difficult for even Mythic raiders and Blizzard just want a good Race to World First, it's still bringing more new eyes to the game by doing this, so overall Mythic mode has been an important addition to the game. At number 8 is a more recent update made to World of Warcraft, and it's one that came in Dragonflight, and that's dragon riding. Mounts have always just been a huge part of World of Warcraft, and everyone has their favourites, but up until Dragonflight, flying mounts just felt kind of, well, not very exciting to use. Well, they do now anyway after you've tried dragon riding in comparison. Whereas your flying mount used to be point it in the right direction and wait for it to reach its location, dragon riding completely changed the whole format. On top of that, Blizzard went and updated practically every mount to have new animations that are unique to dragon riding that fit in with their models thematically. And dragon riding turned flying into something that was just kind of okay and convenient into something totally different. Now there was weight to flight, you gain velocity whilst moving downwards, and have abilities to manage your flight too. Dragon riding has also been introduced as a mechanic on boss fights such as Tindral in Yggdrasil, or Dimensius more recently in Manaforge Omega. There are dragon riding races out in the open world to complete too for the challenge, as well as various achievements. And when you go back to the classic versions of the game with flying after having played modern WoW, honestly it doesn't feel great. You mount up, you press your ascent button, nothing happens happens and you go, oh yeah, we don't do that here, guess I'll just point myself in the right direction and wait. Saying this, there is something about dragon riding which just fits better into the modern game with their zone size and pacing of the gameplay in general and graphics. It's weird because I think the old flying system is definitely worse, but it does work better in the expansions where it already exists, if that makes sense. Either way, dragon riding was a complete overhaul to flying and definitely deserves a place on this list. At number 7, we're heading back to Wrath of the Lich King for an update that took place towards the end of the expansion, the introduction of the Looking for Dungeon tool. The LFD tool was a big turning point in World of Warcraft history and made it easier than ever to find a group and join into a dungeon, and the LFD has been one of the most criticized updates Blizzard has ever done. In the lead up to Classic WoW releasing pre-2019, you'd have believed that the LFD was an update which totally ruined the game, destroyed community, and drove a wedge between player interaction. Then many years later, when Wrath Classic was dropping, Blizzard announced that the LFD would not be returning for the expansion, and the community response was immediately divided. As it turns out, a rather large number of players did in fact not want to stand in Dalaran spamming looking for a tank for 20 minutes and would have just rather pushed a button and been teleported to a dungeon, and Blizzard ended up re-adding the LFD right towards the end of Wrath Classic, about in line with the patch of when it would have been originally released actually. And there are even versions of vanilla now which have adopted the retail LFM tool when it comes to finding groups. Anyways, when the LFD first released in Wrath, it was even controversial then. For the first time ever, you had large groups of players queuing up into heroic dungeons who hadn't really done that much group content otherwise. And yes, infamously, the majority of the heroics were completely face roll in Wrath, but the LFD was released alongside the new ICC dungeons, and those dungeons on heroic could be a bit challenging for a player who, well, didn't really know what they were doing. I mean, that first room in Halls of Reflection, if you remember that back in the day, you know it's pretty easy to wipe there. Wrath of the Lich King quite possibly had WoW's largest player sub count ever too, so the scope of the ability of the players who are being sent into the LFD was super wide, and this could often lead to toxic situations. The LFD also changed the game in that it grouped you with people cross-server and teleported you straight to the dungeon entrance, eliminating the need for you to travel in the world, and people also argued it diminished the sense of having a server community as well. By today's standards, the vast majority of LFD groups are just silent journeys through 5-player content, and most people accept it as a very useful feature. I think, and this is especially true with retail, the vast majority of people are just quiet players who are pretty casual and benefit massively from this system existing. But for Classic, this is an area which is always an ongoing discussion. As far as I'm concerned, you can auto-group me with whoever from the same realm. I don't care if you put me with a boomkin and someone who will roll on the same loot as me. I just want to do the dungeon and play the game. If I cared enough, I'd make my own group. I'm fine with still moving to the dungeon in the open world though, we don't need teleports I don't think. But whatever your opinion of the LFD is, you can't argue it's been a huge game changer for World of Warcraft in so many different ways. Next up is something which will soon be an addition to the game actually, and that is player housing. Since the days of the alpha for World of Warcraft, Blizzard has planned on adding some form of housing into the game, and they're finally getting around to it. And I think when this feature is in the game, it will be a game changer due to the amount of content that it will tie into. Things such as professions, customization, your class's identity or warband, being able to collect various items out in the open world to display in your house, and so on. You know, Blizzard even asked in one of those surveys whether Classic players would like housing in a future version of Vanilla, aka Classic Plus. I don't think it's too likely to happen, but I reckon a lot of people will be off-put because of how things went with garrisons, and they imagine it will be the same thing. I think housing could work with a focus on storage and personal achievement display, as long as you could ensure the player would still have many reasons to leave their house for professions, the auction house, mailbox, trading, enchants, world buffs, and so on. And I'm not even a huge housing fan either in MMOs. The best housing I've played was in WildStar, and there for me housing was something where I went to get an XP buff on ults, and I had some farm patches where I was growing stuff, and that was about it. Overall though, once housing is in the game, it'll be hard to imagine World of Warcraft without it. At number 5, we have a feature that was introduced in Cataclysm during its final patch, the ever controversial Looking for Raid. Looking for Raid was a new system that allowed players to queue for raids remotely and cross-server. It will provide a much easier raiding experience, albeit with loot at a lower item level. The goal of it was to get more people into raiding, since Blizzard were making all this awesome endgame content that, proportionally, not a ton of the players were seeing in relation to the total size of the player base. Do you remember that memorial in the center of Dalaran where you could see the Lich King cinematic at the end of Wrath of the Lich King? Yeah, that was put there because story-wise, most players were never ever going to see that fight themselves, let alone beat it. So along came the story mode for World of Warcraft, or LFR I suppose, which now allows everyone to see the content. I mean, LFR was and always has been a messy experience, but it has its upsides because you do get to experience a form of group content, you get to see the bosses, you get to practice your class, and you get to see the cinematics in-game, rather than just waiting for Wowhead to post them. LFR has always been a divisive addition though. In fact, Ghostcrawler had some words to say on his most problematic content during his time at Blizzard. This was during a Q&A during his time at Riot some years ago, by the way. He said, "I have a lot of regrets about Raid Finder in World of Warcraft. I'm sure I worked on features that were much worse, but that's the one that came to mind. To be clear, the goal of getting more players into raiding is a good one, but the way Raid Finder turned out removed, in my opinion anyway, a lot of the epicness of what made raiding. And now in Mr. Pandaria Classic, Blizzard have fully done away with LFR as a system in our classic timeline. Instead, there are now Celestial Dungeons, which drop LFR equivalent gear, and these will stay updated and relevant as the expansion progresses. These are basically just the dungeons which already exist in the expansion, bumped up a bit in difficulty, with some new mechanics to fit the current raid tier. One of Blizzard's key reasonings for doing this is that nowadays in Classic, a way higher proportion of the player base is actively raiding and seeing the content the game has to offer compared to back in the day. Whether or not this is a better system though, well, of course, people are still split on that. At number 4, I have something which is several updates to the game really, and those are the moments when a new class is added. So we're talking Death Knight in Wrath of the Lich King, Monk in Mr. Pandaria, Demon Hunter in Legion, and Evoker in Dragonflight. A new class is perhaps the single most hype moment for World of Warcraft, and whatever type of player you are, it's always interesting to see how the brand new thing plays. Blizzard have absolutely toned down new class releases over time though. Infamously in Wrath of the Lich King, Death Knights were released as the first hero class, and were just hilariously overpowered to the point where they could tank or DPS as any spec, hit high arena ratings with blue gear, and top damage meters doing just about anything. But a new class totally changes the landscape of the game. It's something to learn and understand for all areas of PvP and PvE. You need to know what kind of roles they do, what are their cooldowns, where do they excel, and so on. And Blizzard have also more recently started to add new specs into the game too, since Demon Hunter and Evoker only released with 2 specializations. Evoker received World of Warcraft's first ever pure support spec in augmentation during Dragonflight, and in Midnight, Demon Hunter will get their 3rd spec, Devourer, which is a void-themed mid-range DPS. A new class is always just so hype, and it's good to see that Blizzard expand on the roster that this game has, as well as adding in the new specs too. Of course, balancing is always an ongoing effort, and things will only get more complicated as they make additions, but when a new class is added, it's always a very big deal. Which means we're on to the top 3 most game-changing updates World of Warcraft has ever seen. 3 things left which I think have made a huge and permanent mark on the game. At 3, I have a brand new endgame edition made in Legion, and that is Mythic Plus. So in earlier WoW expansions, Blizzard had problems keeping their 5-player content relevant, because they would invest so much time into creating them, and then people would blast through them and be done with them in a few weeks in terms of them being endgame content. So in Mr. Pandaria, they introduced challenge modes. These would set your gear to a certain item level, and you would have to complete dungeons as fast as possible to aim for a top spot on your realm's leaderboard. In Warlords of Draenor, they added Mythic Dungeon difficulty too, alongside the new raid difficulty also being upgraded, but this didn't really solve how fast people were done with dungeons at endgame. But in Legion, they tried something completely different, a new difficulty Mythic Plus. This would take the base Mythic dungeons and add affixes to make them more difficult, from simple health or damage increases on trash or bosses from the likes of Fortified or Tyrannical, to affixes that modified how you had to play the dungeon, such as Explosive, Bolstering, or Sanguine. This system would also infinitely scale and offer gear and currency rewards up to a certain cap. Over time, Mythic Plus has changed significantly, with total affix overhauls, modifications to the base difficulty, reward threshold changes, and tons more. Blizzard have even started to incorporate old Mythic Plus dungeons, or dungeons which never had a Mythic Plus to begin with, into seasonal rotations. And Mythic Plus nowadays, as far as I know, is more popular than raiding as an endgame activity, which isn't honestly surprising given the fewer number of players it requires, good rewards, and pug accessibility. Since Mythic Plus was introduced, it's been a massive hit for World of Warcraft, and has completely changed both how the dungeons are designed within the game and how the endgame is approached as a whole, so it absolutely is one of the biggest additions ever made to the game. At the number 2 spot is the earliest gameplay addition made on this list, which may give you some idea what it will be. This update was first introduced at the start of the Burning Crusade, and I am of course talking about flying. I mean, dragon riding is one thing, but being able to fly at all is entirely another. In TBC, for the first time ever, our characters could take to the skies, albeit the non-epic mounts only flew at 60% speed back then. This was upgraded to 150% in Wrath of the Lich King, and let me tell you, you didn't want to fly if you had to go at 60% speed. But this new aerial appreciation of the world totally changed just about everything in the open world forever. Suddenly, traversing the world became easy. You could fly away from PvP encounters you didn't want, and it was just a new experience now. Blizzard made content with flying in mind too, such as the dungeons and raids in Netherstorm, and even made sure you had to buy flying by making summoning to those zones impossible until right towards the end of TBC. Flying has been tied to so many cool mounts entering the game, and has been part of big achievement rewards, be that for PvP or PvE. In Cataclysm and beyond, Blizzard reworked the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor to be flying friendly as well. And did you know Blizzard originally made Warlords of Draenor with no plans for flying, but players have become so attached to this feature that they asked for it back non-stop, until Blizzard finally said, okay, you can have it back, but you have to do this Pathfinder achievement first to show us that you've explored the world, and then you've earned it. And you still have to do Pathfinder for basic flying in the War Within, even though you can dragon ride instantly, which doesn't really make a ton of sense, but okay. Flying for me though has to be up there as one of the most impactful World of Warcraft updates ever, which leaves me with one choice left, one I think is the most impactful World of Warcraft update of all time, and this gameplay update was made on the same patch that LFR was introduced during Cataclysm, which will give it away for some of you, but I'm talking about transmogrification. Now honestly, it's pretty close between the top 3 here of Mythic Plus, flying, and transmog for me. Where transmog has the edge is that basically everyone uses this system all of the time, from level cap characters all the way to new ones. Everyone has their favourite sets or go-to transmog that they use, whether you're some edgy looking knight or you've got a meme set on your Pandaren or anything in between. It's a way for you to make something which you enjoy. Transmog has also made old content stay relevant for just about as long as it's existed. I mean, older content still has mounts and pets too, to be fair, but people always want to go back to farm sets or for completionism's sake. There have also been events introduced such as the Trial of Style in recent expansions as well to complement this system. Transmog changes how everyone looks all of the time, and it's been criticised for this too, where people say it takes away from designers' work or allows people to wear absolute clown suits in Raid, which really don't fit in. And to be honest, it's not a system I'd ever expect to see in more classic versions of the game because of this, but in retail it's hard to deny to what extent the ability to choose your character's appearance has changed the game. Mounts in World of Warcraft started off as themselves being a milestone that we all work towards. Everyone who began at level 1 would have to undergo a massive amount of leveling before you would finally hit level 40 and learn your riding skill, as well as buying your first mount. Or in reality, you get level 40, think nice I can buy my mount, realise you have no gold, and then you'd end up buying it at level 46 or something. But still, over time the level at which you've got your first mount has changed around so much. There have been epic mounts, flying mounts, dragon riding, and so much more. What it takes for a mount to really stand out in this game has become more and more difficult to achieve, yet some mounts to this day are incredibly rare within modern World of Warcraft. They represent times gone by for some players, or a moment when you were able to earn something through limited time events. Today I want to go over what are 10 of the rarest, no longer obtainable mounts in World of Warcraft. These will range from mounts that you may have on your account if you play long enough, to mounts which I can more or less guarantee not only you don't own, but you've probably never even seen them. These have to be the 10 rarest mounts in World of Warcraft. First up at number 10 is the Frostbrood Proto-Worm. Whilst this mount was available for a shorter period of time than many others on this list, it was also released much more recently, so people have become a bit more accustomed to the idea of collection, and it was also locked behind a pretty easy task, meaning a decent number of players will have had time to ensure they've collected this mount whilst it was available. The Frostbrood Proto-Worm was a promo for Wrath of the Lich King Classic that was available for about 3 months between September and November of 2022, and to get it you simply had to complete the Death Knight starter zone on either Horde or Alliance, and then you'd get this mount on retail. The idea here was to try and get players of modern World of Warcraft over to Classic to try the original Death Knight, and to see if some of them would get interested and stick around to try the expansion for a bit longer. This mount was a big hook to get people on board, as it had the kind of details you'd typically see from either something on the store or at least the trading post. After Wrath Classic officially released, this mount was made unobtainable, and there hasn't been a way to get it since, though unlike some of the other mounts I'll talk about today, I could see Blizzard possibly adding this back into the game one day in some way or another. Next is one of the earliest mounts to be made discontinued on this list, and that is the Amani Warbear. Chances are if you played TBC Classic, you now have this mount in your collection. I mean, I feel like everyone who played the patch where Zul'Aman dropped even a little bit ended up getting this bear. At the time when the Amani Warbear dropped too, bear type mounts were super rare within the game, so to have earned this made you really stand out amongst the crowd. To obtain it was, well, fairly straightforward. You just had to have defeated all the animal-themed bosses in Zul'Aman within a 25-minute time frame. So at the start of the dungeon, you'd begin with 15 minutes, and then the first and second bosses would add a further 5 minutes each to the timer. If you were able to do this, a prisoner that was due to be sacrificed would give you a bag that would contain the mount guaranteed, meaning if you were doing this place daily, you'd get this mount pretty quickly, especially if you're running with guildies. Of course, back in the day, this was seen as much more of a speed run, and the rarity of the mount in retail speaks to how much more of a challenge this was seen as being at the time. Jeff Kaplan had some words about the removal of this mount in fact. He says once Wrath goes live, you'll no longer be able to obtain the Zul'Aman bear mount by saving all 4 prisoners in the timed run. To be clear, the Zul'Aman bear mount is supposed to be an item of very high prestige, and we want players who have earned it during the appropriate era to be recognised for their accomplishment. Later, still in Cataclysm, when Blizzard brought back Zul'Aman and ZG as 5-player dungeons, they re-added in a bear mount for saving prisoners, calling it the Amani Battle Bear, as a bit of a throwback to the original, though let's be real, the Warbear has always looked way cooler. Next I want to talk about a bunch of mounts actually, all of those that can be obtained as an ahead of the curve achievement reward. Traditionally in World of Warcraft now, defeating a final boss of an expansion since Mists of Pandaria on either Heroic or Mythic has earned you a unique mount to show off. So far those are the Kor'kron Warwolf from Garrosh Hellscream and Mists of Pandaria, the Grove Warden from Archimonde in Warlords of Draenor, the Violet Spellwing from Argus in Legion, the Uncorrupted Voidwing from N'Zoth in BFA, and most recently the Carcinized Zeref Steed from the Jailer in Shadowlands. In Dragonflight they had a dragon riding customization to resemble Fyrakk as a mount, instead of him himself actually just giving you some kind of mount, so I guess this kind of counts as well. Either way, the nature of ahead of the curve requires you to defeat what is a reasonably difficult boss on at least a heroic difficulty level, meaning this can be quite challenging to do, especially if you're not actively raiding within a guild, though since you do have the entire patch to defeat the boss, by the end of it with all the power creep in the game and potential nerf, things do tend to become much easier, or you can just get boosted as well to be fair, can't you? Still, whether you just have 1 or 2 of these or all of them, I think they definitely count as some of the rarer mounts in the game. So I think with those first 3 there is a pretty good chance that you've managed to get at least some of them. From here on out, things are going to start to get a lot more challenging. Well, at least in terms of having these mounts on modern World of Warcraft. On Classic, there's a pretty good chance you have them, but that's its whole own different thing. At number 7 though is the Reigns of the Black Proto-Drake. This was awarded through the meta achievement Glory of the Raider 25 in Wrath of the Lich King. As achievements were first rolled out in Wrath, this was the first set of meta achievements to award a mount, though I believe we didn't know at the time that the mount would be removed and that it was a limited time thing. The achievement in question involved you completing max 25 whilst meeting a bunch of different requirements, such as how many players you brought, defeating bosses within a certain time frame, and so on. And whilst Nax and Tier 7 for that matter were infamously face roll, as well as this mount being available for about 5 months, it's still pretty rare within the game. Also, this isn't to be confused with the Reigns of the Plagued Proto-Drake either. This was awarded from the Glory of the Raider 10-man achievement, however this was re-added into the game via the Black Market Auction House during Mists of Pandaria, whereas the Black Drake wasn't. Also, this was one of the very few 310% speed flying mounts in the game at this time. Up to Wrath, the only way to get this speed on a flying mount previously was a rank 1 PvP mount or Ashes of Allah, so this speaks to the prestige that Blizzard and the players would have associated with this mount back in the day. In fact, you couldn't even train 310% flying speed until Cataclysm, but the Black Proto-Drake is still a rare sight in retail, despite it being seen as one of the easier meta achievement mounts from original World of Warcraft. Next up, we're heading into Trial of the Grand Crusader for some more unavailable mounts. First is the set of mounts that could be earned from completing a tribute to Insanity 10 player. This involved completing Trial of the Grand Crusader on 10 player without having white. This awarded the Swift Alliance Steed or the Swift Horde Wolf, depending on your faction. Trial of the Grand Crusader was the raid where they pushed the most rewards possible with the whole attempt system intact. In fact, you had 50 attempts per week on heroic mode back then, so if you wiped 50 times, that was it. The bosses despawn and you just had to come back next week and try again. Trial of the Grand Crusader was also the first raid to take on the heroic mode difficulty that had been used in dungeons since TBC. Whilst Ulduar before it had hard mode that could be activated on some bosses by taking certain actions, heroic was simply a difficulty you set the raid to before entering, and really it works the same way as it does today. Also back in the day during original Wrath, no lockouts were shared between Trial of the Crusader 10 and 25 and Trial of the Grand Crusader 10 and 25, so you could do this raid 4 times per reset if you wanted to, and the gear was a big step up from Ulduar. Remember, Blizzard actually buffed loads of the gear in Ulduar to make it more competitive during Wrath Classic, so a lot of people really spammed this raid back in the day. I bet many successful 25 player guilds downscaled to farm 10 for some items and to grab the achievements and their rewards as well. In Wrath Classic, Blizzard also made 10 and 25 share lockouts across different difficulties amidst concerns that players would burn them out spamming this raid on all difficulties, as people had the tendency to do back in the day, which for our modern gaming crowd was probably the right call. So in Wrath Classic, if you were committed to a 25 player guild, you'd have had to have foregone a week of loot to try at this achievement. I did Trial of the Grand Crusader every single reset, and I am really not sure if I ever did a single 10-man, to be honest. It's just kind of awkward to downscale from 25 to 10 really. Overall though, these pair of mounts remain one of the rarest sets in World of Warcraft, but there was something that was even more difficult to get from Trial of the Grand Crusader, and that was from the achievement A Tribute to Immortality. This not only involved completing a run of Trial of the Grand Crusader 25 with no wipes, but also with no deaths in the raid at all. This awarded either the Crusaders white or black warhorse depending on your faction, and to be honest, even in Wrath Classic, this was still not easy to obtain. Yes, in theory all the bosses are very easy by today's standards, but any mistake means it's over for the entire raid, and you can't just reset either. It's one attempt at this per week. So if you have this mount from back in the day, this means you were in a serious raiding guild. Unlike some other mounts too, such as the Head of the Curve ones, you couldn't even boost to get this mount either because of the 0 death stipulation of the achievement. If someone's getting boosted, they're gonna stand somewhere stupid and die at some point. The final boss, Anubarak, was always a tense moment too during his final phase, as he would drain a large percentage of your maximum health every second, meaning you were intended needed to basically have the entire raid on next to no health all of the time, and healers had to carefully manage health bars to ensure that they didn't go and that nobody died. Honestly, this is one of the harder achievements to have a mount reward ever in World of Warcraft, even by today's standards. Believe me, it's just so easy for one thing to go wrong when you get one try per week with 25 people in a raid. At the number 4 spot are a set of mounts which, if you saw them in game, you probably wouldn't give them a second look. You just think, oh, it's some low level player on a very standard looking starter mount. But in reality, these are some of the rarest mounts in the game, and these are all of the original epic mounts within World of Warcraft. They rode at 100% speed, but they didn't have armor as the epic mounts that came later did. These were obtainable during vanilla from launch up to patch 1.4. After 1.4, Blizzard added updated mount models into the game, the same ones that exist today, and offered you the chance to trade in your old epic mount for a new one. Some players, however, had grown attached to their first epic mount, and even though the updated ones definitely had more flair to them, they kept on to their original mount, which many years later turned out to be a decision that a lot more people would have made if they knew the rarity these mounts would have. These mounts have also never existed in our classic timeline either. Blizzard were asked about adding them before release, and they said they didn't want to add them into the game, as players may have felt pressured to level fast and to earn tons of gold to buy them before they would have been discontinued in accordance with when this would have happened originally. I mean, they could have just added them in and left them there, but things were very no changes back then, so Blizzard were doing right by the community with this attitude. These mounts are the only ones that didn't return to the game with Classic, so if you still have one today on retail, they should always retain their rarity, which is pretty cool. On to the top 3 now for mounts, and these are the ones which are super rare. First is the Black Kiraji Resonating Crystal used to summon the Black Battle Tank mount. The undertaking to earn this mount was a truly legendary feat, and as you may well know, was tied to the opening of the gates of AQ during vanilla World of Warcraft. The rarity of this mount in modern WoW really has several factors. Only a handful of players per realm would realistically be able to achieve this mount in the limited time frame when it was available. This was because a massive quest chain to obtain the Scepter of the Shifting Sands had to be completed, alongside the war effort too, which involved turning in literally millions of items between each faction. After both of these steps had been completed, any player with the Scepter could sound the gong outside of AQ, starting the 10-hour war. Any other player with a Scepter also had to turn the quest in during this time frame, otherwise they would have missed their window and would be unable to get the mount. The server-wide effort that went into this was, without exaggeration, still probably the most ambitious event Blizzard has ever held within the game, and taking part in this and going for the mount would have been your entire life for several weeks in a row. Due to one player being able to bang the gong to start the event, the limited time nature of it, and the server-wide collaboration, it's not hard to picture why so few players earned this mount back in the day. Now during Classic, it's quite a different story of course. Whilst it was still as ever a monumental effort, you bet that a lot more people this time around wanted to earn themselves that Scarab Lord title and mount. As such, people would collude between factions to ensure that designated players had farmed their scepters and were ready to turn the quest in prior to the war effort completing. As far as I know, the Russian server Flamegore counted the largest number of Scarab Lords with 90 in total. This would have been totally unimaginable back in the original vanilla. Still, with so many more people earning this title and mount, it really isn't all that common in Classic, and much less so in retail. But wait, there is more. Did you know at the start of Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard released a new set of realms for World of Warcraft due to the growth of the game? These new realms had auto-completed the war effort part of the AQ40 quest, but the gong had never been rung. This meant that people transferred over there with the materials for the quest and raced to complete it as soon as possible, and then earn themselves a Scarab Lord title and mount in Wrath of the Lich King legitimately. In fact, according to references online, there was a player that was able to do this some 5 days after these new realms released. I guess they came prepared. Next is a mount that exactly one player has within the game, and these are the Reigns of the Bengal Tiger. This tiger was given to Amara as part of her Make-A-Wish to Blizzard, along with the Jennifer Battle Pet, her puzzle, Amara's own NPC, and a song she wrote for the game. In the run-up to Classic, there was an interesting story kind of related to this shared from Tom Chilton, where there was some promo footage that showed a night elf on an orange mount, which Chris Metzen pulled, as apparently this just wasn't a fitting mount palette for night elves. I mean, there is the Zulian Tiger from ZG, or even more recently the Golden Saber Cat from Season of Discovery, but these are tigers raised by trolls, I suppose. This makes the Bengal Tiger even more special and totally unique within the World of Warcraft universe for its owner. And at the number 1 spot is a mount which is said to not even exist anymore, though chances are pretty high that you've heard of it: the ever-elusive fluorescent green Mechanostrider. The story of the mount goes that the player Nash had deleted their Mechanostrider mount somehow and contacted a GM and asked for it to be returned. The GM who responded accidentally gave them the fluorescent green Mechanostrider instead of a model that was available to players through vendors, effectively making this the only version of this mount to ever have been available in World of Warcraft. Well, unless we are counting the fluorescent green Mechanostrider that dropped from Mechaneer Thermoplug during Season of Discovery, which was a very nice reference from Blizzard here, but of course people who have that mount are still in that version of the game. However, it would seem as though this unique Mechanostrider skin doesn't even exist anymore. Several comments on Wowhead say something along the lines of, Nash of the EU Realm Frostmane had this mount from early Burning Crusade up until patch 6.2, and Nash posted themselves that the mount was removed from their journal. The reasoning for this removal was allegedly that the owner had tried to sell the account, and given the very unique selling point of it, I guess in one way or another Blizzard caught wind of this and were not best pleased and removed it from their journal, which makes the fluorescent green Mechanostrider not only the rarest mount in the game, but perhaps the only mount to ever have been fully removed from the game, even to the extent of not being in a player's journal anymore. And that's it, 10 of what I think are the absolute rarest mounts in World of Warcraft's history, from ones which were pretty tough to get back in the day to a few completely unique additions. Let me know if you've managed to collect any of these, and are there any others you would have included here. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you all in the next one very soon.